Chapter 850. Today happened to be Alessandra's 16th birthday. The girl called Eric last month and asked if he was free to come to New York. Eric didn't give an exact answer at the time. After parting with Stan Lee, Eric didn't have any other plans tonight, so he rushed over at the last minute. Taking the elevator to the top floor of the 85-story building, Eric came to the door of the apartment and pressed the doorbell several times. There was no response, so they probably went out to celebrate. Eric also expected this in advance, so he specifically asked someone to send a spare key, so he opened the door and walked in. Because of his deep-rooted instinctive resistance to the small space in his memory, the properties Eric purchased were basically very spacious, and the one in front of him was no exception. The two-story duplex structure had a total area of nearly 1,200 square meters, with 4 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms, a study, kitchen, dining room, gym, and private screening room. The living room was also more than 100 square meters, which was very spacious. This mansion was one of the first properties Eric purchased during the Kuwait War oil crisis. Because it was located in a prime location overlooking the entire Upper East Side, and because it was the top floor of the building, the price at the time was $12 million. With the recovery of the U.S. economy and real estate in recent years, the current price should be close to $20 million, and the future appreciation space was even more unpredictable. The 6 huge double-layered tempered glass windows on the south and west of the living room reflected the lights of the entire Manhattan. The interior decoration was mainly warm and light-colored. There was no need to turn on the lights, so the living room didn't appear dark. There was a faint fragrance in the air, and Eric could also tell that Giselle and Alessandra had made some feminine changes to the living room. After putting the cake and bouquet on the long table in the corner of the living room, Eric didn't turn on the lights in the room. He quietly walked to a window. Every window around the living room had a marble windowsill that could accommodate one person. Eric also saw a pillow on the windowsill in front of him. He thought that Giselle or Alessandra liked to lean on this window to enjoy the scenery of Manhattan. The view at night was nothing, just the brilliant falling stars. If it was daytime, standing in front of the window overlooking the world-class metropolis of New York would indeed give people the feeling of looking down on all living things from the clouds. Eric casually leaned against the pillow and sat on the windowsill. He looked at the scenery outside the window for a while. He raised his wrist and looked at his watch. It was already past 9:30. He didn't know if the two girls would be crazy outside until midnight. After thinking about it, Eric took out his phone. Just as he was about to call Giselle, he heard the door open. Soon, the sound of high heels clacking could be heard from the entrance, accompanied by excited discussions. It sounded like there were quite a lot of people. Eric frowned slightly. When he gave the keys to Giselle and Eric, he reminded them not to bring any random people back. He thought that the two girls knew what rules to follow. The lights quickly turned on, and a group of young and beautiful girls appeared in front of Eric. Because the night in New York was still quite cold in April, the girls were basically wearing slim jackets and jeans. Their devilish proportions gave a strong visual impact of legs as far as the eye could see. Eric also noticed the figures of Giselle and Alessandra walking in front. Obviously, from the standard tall figures of these girls, they should be Giselle and Alessandra's close friends. Some of the girls were holding beer and snacks in their arms. It seemed like they were preparing to have a party in the apartment. All the girls walked into the living room. Eric glanced around and didn't find any male creatures before his expression relaxed. Because they hadn't been together for long, Eric and the two girls didn't have much feelings for each other. The relationship between the two sides was very simple for the time being. Although he promised Giselle that he would make her the second Drew, people's hearts were always fickle. After a few years, if they wanted to leave, Eric wouldn't have any nostalgia. As a person of two lives, coupled with the rise in status and wealth over the years, Eric's temperament inevitably became more indifferent and indifferent to worldly affairs. If other men appeared in this apartment tonight, Eric would immediately let Giselle and Alessandra move out of this apartment and have no contact with them in the future. Wow, it's so big. God, this is the ultimate dream of my life. If I can live here, I'm willing to do anything. Along with a burst of excited and surprised gasps, the girls also noticed Eric, who was sitting on the windowsill and looking at them. Everyone was instantly startled. But immediately, Alessandra rushed over and said excitedly, "Eric, when did you come?" "I just arrived. I wanted to give you a surprise." Eric sat up, smiled and hugged Alessandra, who rushed into his arms, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Happy birthday." "Thank you, Eric." Alessandra also kissed Eric on the cheek and said. Giselle also came over. She keenly noticed the displeasure that flashed through Eric's expression just now. Thinking of Eric's initial instructions, she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. The other girls had already recognized Eric at this time. They were surprised with all kinds of envy and jealousy. After learning that Giselle and Alessandra lived in this building, they guessed that there must be a big shot behind Giselle and Alessandra, but no one thought that this person would be Eric Williams. This was definitely beyond everyone's wildest imagination. But then, they also felt that it was natural. After all, the type of top-floor mansion in front of them was usually only used by the rich as their own residence. Only someone like Eric Williams could so easily and generously take out a Madison Avenue top-floor duplex mansion for his lover to live in. Eric hugged Giselle again and whispered a few words. He raised his head and looked at the group of beautiful women in front of him who were obviously eager to try. He smiled and greeted, "Hey girls." Eric's tone of voice imitated the usual opening line used by Charlie Townsend, the behind-the-scenes boss of the detective agency, when he contacted the three angels in The Break-In Girls. Obviously, this group of girls had basically watched The Break-In Girls. They responded almost in unison, "Hi, Eric." "Well, it seems that you have all watched that movie," Eric smiled and took a dozen cans of beer from the girl standing in the front row. He looked at it and said, "This is a party, but these beers are not very good. I'll get someone to send some over." With that said, Eric sat back on the windowsill, took out his mobile phone and dialed his assistant's number. He looked up at the girls in front of him and said, "Peter, get someone to send some party drinks over. About 20 people. Hurry up." Seeing Eric hang up the phone, a bold girl rushed to say, "Eric, there are only 15 of us. 20 people. Are you trying to get us all drunk?" Eric showed a somewhat naughty expression and said, "Why not? Maybe I will do something even more outrageous. Those who are afraid can leave early. It may be too late later." "Ah!" the girls screamed. There were a few girls who showed hesitation on their faces, but no one was willing to turn around and leave. Eric smiled and clapped his hands. He said, "Okay, go and get ready. Move the set of tables and chairs in the middle to the corner. Also, do you have any good music records at home?" Eric looked at Giselle. Giselle nodded and said, "They are in the living room upstairs." "Eric, let's go change and get the records." With that said, Giselle pulled Alexandria toward the stairs. The other girls consciously began to move the furniture in the living room. Alexandria was pulled upstairs by Giselle. She rubbed her wrist that was hurting and complained, "What are you doing? I don't want to change clothes." Giselle glared at Alexandria and continued to walk toward the bedroom. She said angrily, "It's all your fault. You had to hold a party at home. Now, you sent a group of little bitches to Eric." Alexandria, of course, didn't notice the way the group of girls looked at Eric. She shrank her neck with a guilty conscience. After all, she was only 16 years old. After all, she still had the vanity of a girl. She wanted to show off her luxurious apartment to her friends, but she didn't expect to be so clever. Alexander tiptoed behind Giselle like a kitten and tried to defend himself. You agreed to it." Giselle didn't look back. She went to the bedroom and opened the closet. She picked out clothes and said, "If someone suggested to throw you out of here, I would also agree." Alexandria didn't dare to talk back. She stretched out her small hand and picked out her favorite dress. Just as she was about to change into it, someone knocked on the bedroom door. Giselle and Alexandria turned their heads at the same time. A few girls had already walked over. They looked at Giselle and Alexandria's closet with shining eyes. One of the girls said, "Giselle, can we borrow a few dresses to wear?" Alexandria habitually smiled. She was about to speak when she felt her waist being pinched by Giselle. Giselle warned Alexandria to shut her mouth. She also had a smile on her face. She refused without hesitation. Sorry, Karen. I'm not used to others wearing my clothes. The girl named Karen wasn't discouraged. She turned to Alexandria. Then you. Alexandria quickly shook her head. I am not used to it either. The other girl beside Karen rolled her eyes. She pulled her companion and smiled slyly. Karen, why don't we go downstairs and be kind to Eric? Maybe he'll ask the Chanel store to send a dozen dresses over. They definitely won't be worse than the ones in Giselle's closet. I've been wanting to buy Chanel for a long time. The other girls weren't stupid. They all smiled and agreed. Giselle wanted to pinch Alexandria again. She helplessly moved aside. Okay. Pick whatever you want. You little bitches. Haha. The girls didn't mind Giselle's words at all. They giggled and swarmed up. A moment later, the other girls also rushed upstairs to borrow clothes. Out of sight, out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. She quickly changed into a purple dress and went to the living room to pick out the music records she was going to use later. Seeing Alexander follow her, Giselle said, "Ale, stick to Eric like a piece of gum later. Don't give those guys a chance, okay?" I know. Alexandria quickly nodded, but she didn't forget to mutter. Chewing gum. TSK. Disgusting. Giselle immediately raised a disc in her hand and slapped it on Alexandria's head. It's all your fault. Alexandria was too lazy to resist. He let Giselle hit him and said, I just think, do you have to be so nervous? You're now the fastest rising newcomer in the fashion industry. I should be the one who's nervous. You've walked in dozens of top brand shows in the past 2 fashion weeks. You've made a name for yourself. Eric will only give me a chance this autumn. If he takes a fancy to other girls, I'll be in trouble. So you know everything? I'm not a fool. Alexandria curled her lips. She felt a girl's figure pass by outside the door. She subconsciously turned her head and looked back. I just think that since it's already like this, there's no use in regretting. Giselle rolled her eyes at Alexandria and didn't say anything more. However, she wasn't as relaxed as Alexandria. Although Eric pushed her to a position that many models couldn't reach in their lifetime in just 1 year, in fact, she could only be regarded as a newcomer with good potential. Due to age restrictions and other factors, she hadn't gotten any brand endorsement yet. She couldn't compare with the supermodels at the top of the industry pyramid. In recent years, due to Victoria's Secret's rapidly increasing market share from 10% to more than 40%, Ltd spared no effort in the creation of the Victoria's Secret Angel brand. Coupled with the support of Firefly Group's media resources, the dozens of supermodels in the Victoria's Secret Angel Corps not only had the highest exposure and top income in the industry, but also almost monopolized most of the high-end brand resources in the fashion industry. There was a popular opinion in the fashion industry that if you couldn't walk on the runway of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, then you didn't deserve the title of supermodel. Similarly, you couldn't squeeze into the top circle of the industry. The number of people in the Victoria's Secret Angel Corps had always been maintained at about 40, while the industry had hundreds of thousands of workers. One could imagine how fierce the competition was. Without the direct support of Eric, the founder of the Victoria's Secret fashion show, even if you were lucky enough to walk in the Victoria's Secret fashion show, it would be very difficult to go further. The Victoria's Secret Angel Corps also had a clear hierarchy and fierce competition. Giselle had always been very clear that she wasn't beautiful enough. She still didn't understand why Eric had chosen her, but she definitely valued this opportunity more than anyone else. She once swore that she would never experience the feeling of being short of money because she lost $50. It was as if the sky was falling down. If because of today's mistake, other girls around her were to gain Eric's favor, or even replace her and Alessandra's position, then she would probably find a place to cry. Giselle picked a few records and brought Alessandra downstairs. At this time, the fluorescent lights in the living room had been turned off, leaving only a few pale yellow wall lamps on. A long table was already filled with all kinds of drinks, candies, and snacks, and even a dazzling array of party toys. But what bothered Giselle more was that a group of girls had changed into flamboyant long skirts and even hot pants. Most of these were her clothes, and she didn't know how they would be ruined tonight. She had spent most of her income in the past year on this. After all, this was essential for a girl in her profession. Alessandra didn't make any money at all. Although no one would charge them rent for this mansion, living in this environment, the monthly expenses were also thousands of dollars. The two of them didn't live well at all. Of course, Giselle thought about Eric, but she instinctively felt that no matter how rich a man was, he wouldn't like a woman who asked for money. She didn't want Eric to be disgusted with her. Looking at Eric, who was still sitting on the windowsill but was surrounded by several girls, Giselle stuffed the records in her hand to Alessandra and walked straight over. Eric said something that made the girls around him giggle. One of the girls even wanted to softly lean over. Giselle squeezed over and sat on the edge of the windowsill. In the surprised and envious eyes of all the girls, her slender body intimately leaned in Eric's arms. She didn't have the sharpness that she had when she was with Alessandra. Like a little wild cat that had put away its claws, she tilted her head and pecked on Eric's cheek. She asked in a low voice, "Eric, what are you talking about?" Eric didn't mind Giselle's obvious thoughts. He reached out and held the girl's slender waist, bowed his head and kissed her lips. He smiled and said, "We're talking about Hollywood. I know a lot of gossip." Just then, dynamic music sounded in the living room, and the girls began to dance unconsciously. Eric saw that the girls were a little uneasy and said with a smile, "Let's go dance. I like to see you dance." When Eric spoke, the girls were no longer restrained and quickly gathered in the center of the living room. They cheered and screamed to the music and danced to their heart's content. There were also girls who boldly looked at Eric, twisting their bodies and making bold flirtatious movements. Although it was impossible to create a fanatical atmosphere like in a nightclub in a short period of time, looking at a group of girls with looks and figures above 80 dancing like boneless mermaids, that kind of visual stimulation was definitely enough to make a man's blood boil. Seeing Alessandra join the crowd and waving to them, Giselle got up and said, "Eric, let's go dance." "I'll just watch. You go." Eric smiled and shook his head. Giselle didn't want to give a group of little she-wolves an opportunity. She took the initiative to take off the leather shoes on Eric's feet, pulled his hand coquettishly, and insisted, "Come on, it's boring if you don't dance." Eric didn't resist too much. He took off his coat and walked to the center of the living room with Giselle's strength. The girls quickly surrounded him. Eric held Giselle and gently danced to the music skillfully. After a while, he felt Giselle's warm and soft body pressing closer to him. At the same time, she whispered in his ear, "Eric, let's go to the bedroom, okay?" This body, after all, had the vitality of a young man. It would be abnormal if there was no reaction in the midst of a soft and fragrant body. However, Eric wasn't so impatient. He didn't respond to Giselle's question. Instead, he reached out and pulled Alessandra over. He put Giselle and him together and said with a smile, "You two dance for me." Giselle, of course, knew what Eric's specific request was. She obediently didn't resist and hugged Alessandra. The two of them danced and kissed naturally. There was a burst of laughter and screams around them. Eric looked at the two girls' performance and felt a few girls around him coming closer. He reached out and grabbed one of the girls in his arms. The girl was also tall. She had short blonde hair and a slightly childish baby face. Her eyes were big, her face was small, and her lips were thin. She wore light smoky makeup and looked like a real Barbie. What was even more surprising was the girl's slender waist. It was so slim that Eric could almost wrap his hands around it. "Your waist is so thin. I'm suddenly curious. Are you 16 years old?" Because they were hugging, the girl could also feel the changes in Eric's body. Her face was slightly red, but she didn't break away from Eric's embrace. Instead, she took the initiative to hug Eric's waist and gently rubbed against it. When she heard Eric's question, she replied, "Eric, I'm going to be 21 years old soon." "Wow, I really couldn't tell. I thought I was committing a crime just now." "Hee hee." The girl smiled and took the initiative to introduce herself. "My name is Chu Si Goff." Eric didn't remember this name and wasn't very interested. Maybe they wouldn't meet again after tonight. However, he still replied considerately, Goff. Is this a German surname? Chusi Goff shook her head and said, Of course not. It's an Orthodox English surname, just like yours. Eric looked down at the girl's face, especially the shape of her lips. It was obviously similar to Diane Kruger's. Hence, he said, But I think you must have German blood, right? Chusi Goff nodded and said, Yes, it's from my mother. Then she must be a great beauty, Eric said with a smile. I think so too. Chusi Goff chuckled and looked at Eric with her bright eyes. After a short conversation, she unconsciously let go of her initial discomfort. She inexplicably had a good impression of Eric. After a moment, the girl even boldly stood on her tiptoes and kissed Eric. Eric wasn't the kind of person who liked to kiss unfamiliar girls. His misophobia was actually quite serious. Although sometimes his relationship with the women around him developed quite quickly, it was mainly because he was quite familiar with them in his previous life. Slightly turning his head to avoid the girl's lips, Eric politely kissed her white and tender cheek gently and said with a smile, I don't want our relationship to develop too quickly. Chusi Goff was a little disappointed, but she didn't show it. She still smiled and said, Eric, I'm tired. Let's go for a drink, okay? Okay, but you have to be careful. I like to get women drunk. Chusi Goff was not afraid at all. She smiled and said, Why can't I get you drunk? Okay, then let's try. After a loop of the record, the girls were also tired from dancing. Just as they were about to take a break, they found that Eric and the girls were already clustered on a sofa. He held a bottle cap in his hand and reached out to throw it at an empty glass on the floor not far away. With a tinkling sound, the bottle cap accurately fell into the glass. Ah, so annoying. We lost again. The girls around him complained together, but they didn't hesitate to drink the wine in their hands. Then, like a group of crazy kittens, they shouted, Again, again. Are you sure? Eric asked with a smile. Of course, of course. Okay. Eric said and threw another bottle cap. The tinkling sound was heard again. The other girls also gathered around. When they saw Eric throw the bottle cap accurately into the glass twice in a row, they shouted, Wow, no, Eric, you must be cheating. Eric smiled. Strictly speaking, he was cheating. This was because he often played this game when he went to nightclubs in his previous life, so he should be considered to have practiced it. But tonight, his luck seemed to be exceptionally good. Chusi Goff beside him pulled his right hand over, as if she wanted to check if there was a scope or something. Eric laughed and said, Forget it, I won't bully you. Why don't we change to another game? You can pick whatever you want. Immediately, a girl waved a deck of poker cards in her hand. How about poker cards? This way, Eric, you can't cheat? Eric nodded and said, Okay, let's play together. Let's make it simple. Everyone draws a card. Those whose cards are smaller than mine drink. If everyone's cards are bigger than mine, then I drink. Wow, how can we win? How can we do this? Eric, you're too shameless. There was another round of criticism. Eric smiled and said, How about this, let's add some chips. I'm more confident in this. Chusi Goff laughed and said, Then we can't afford to play with you even if we sell ourselves. Okay, you don't have to pay. I'll lose once, $100,000, and a private jet to send you to any city in the world for shopping. London, Paris, Tokyo, anywhere you want. But you have to add some chips too. How about it? Chapter 851. Those who were able to hang out with Giselle and Alexander were naturally not small models. Although the modeling industry seemed glamorous, the income was actually not high. Only a few of them could earn more than $100,000 a year. Eric's bet of $100,000 and a private jet shopping trip immediately made the girls scream. But soon, a girl questioned, Eric, even if each of us has a 50-50 chance of winning you, the probability of all of us winning is only 1 out of 2 to the 14th power. This probability is almost zero. It's too unfair. Eric looked over in surprise. The one who spoke was a girl with a Latina appearance. She was not very beautiful, but her body was tall and hot. I didn't expect there to be a math girl here. Hey, Eric, you're discriminating, Chu Si-goff, who was leaning on Eric, immediately protested in dissatisfaction. Okay, I apologize, Eric smiled and looked at the girl who spoke just now. He said, "What's your name?" Hearing Eric's question, the girl who originally had a slight accent immediately replied carefully, "Fernanda Tavares." Eric patted the thigh of the girl on his left and smiled. "I like girls who know math. Come sit here." Fernanda Tavares walked over without hesitation. The girl who was originally sitting there reluctantly gave up her seat. Giselle and Alexander, who were squeezed not far away, were even more depressed. Fernanda Tavares was from Brazil. Alexander invited her today because they were from the same hometown. He did not expect her to be a little bitch who knew math. Damn it. Speaking of which, what the hell does 1 out of 2 to the 14th power mean? Giselle, whose English was still not very good, thought bitterly. She could not help but stare at Alexander. Alexander shrunk his neck and continued to pretend to be a little white rabbit. Eric gestured to the girl sitting on the carpet next to the coffee table to pass a glass of champagne to Fernanda Tavares. Then he said, "Okay, if I draw A, I lose. This way, you have a 1 out of 13 chance of winning. $100,000 each time. Hey, it's your turn to raise the chips." The surrounding was silent for a moment. The girls began to think involuntarily. Then a girl suddenly shouted, I understand. Eric, you want us to take off our clothes, right? It must be like this." The other girls seemed to have suddenly understood what was going on, and they all started laughing and joking around. Eric also laughed and said, "I'm not interested in A-cup bodies like you. You look better with clothes on." The average cup size of professional models was generally not high. When Eric created the Victoria's Secret show, although he deliberately selected the batch of models with the best figures, in order to achieve the best effect, many of the angels still had to use small tricks like squeezing pads. Although Eric was telling the truth, there was still a dissatisfied protest around him. Chu Si-goff patted Eric lightly with her small hand and said angrily, "Then what do you want, Eric? Do you want us to accompany you to bed?" Eric turned his head and kissed Chu Si-goff's small face. He nodded expectantly and said, "That's a good suggestion." Ah! Amidst the screams, a bunch of candy pillows and other small objects flew over. Eric almost reached out to cover his ears. He hurriedly said, "Stop, stop, stop. I can't stand you little vixens swarming me. Okay, since you don't have any powerful chips, I'll stick a note on it." Chu Si-goff immediately said, "Eric, that's ugly, and it'll ruin the makeup on my face." Eric reached out to take the deck of cards, shuffled them, and replied with a smile, "How uncreative. I didn't say that it has to be on my face. Other places are fine too." The girls were stunned for a moment, and then there was another round of screams. I knew it, I knew it. Eric still wants us to take off our clothes." Okay. If you keep screaming, I'll be deafened by your little voices. Let's start now. We'll continue until all the drinks are finished." After understanding Eric's intentions, the girls' reactions were very intense, but in the end, none of them retreated. They all gathered around. Because the rules were simple, the game went very quickly. In the end, they still couldn't finish all the drinks. When most of the girls were drunk and on the verge of collapsing, and 2 of them rushed to the bathroom, Eric timely announced the end of the game. When he woke up again, it was already dawn. 2 warm and soft bodies were nestled beside him. It was Giselle and Alessandra. Although he didn't lose many times last night, he was poured a full glass of champagne by the girls every time. Eric wasn't too relaxed. He didn't have the strength to pay attention to a group of drunk girls. He just carried Giselle and Alessandra into the bedroom and fell asleep in each other's arms. Looking at his watch, it was already 8:30. Today, he still had to continue to discuss the affairs of Marvel Pictures, so Eric sat up. As Eric got up, Alessandra snorted twice, changed his position and didn't move again. Giselle opened her eyes and murmured good morning. She leaned over and pressed her body against Eric. Feeling the man's morning desire, she whispered, "Eric, do you want it?" It was past midnight when the game ended last night. Although Eric was still awake, he didn't want to rashly take away the first time of the two girls when they were drunk, so he didn't do anything. Although he also wanted to, Eric kissed Giselle's face and said with a smile, "Now is not a good time. Next time. And I lost a lot of money last night. I have to hurry to work to earn it back." Giselle, of course, could feel that Eric didn't take the opportunity to take her last night. She was a little touched by the man's thoughtfulness. She reached over and grabbed him. She whispered in his ear, "Then let's take a shower. I can help you with my mouth first." Feeling Giselle's little tongue gently teasing his cheek, Eric finally couldn't resist the temptation. He got out of bed and picked Giselle up. The girl chuckled and walked to the bathroom. More than half an hour later, the two came out of the bathroom. Eric knew that he was destined to be late today. Although it didn't matter if he was late, he still hung up the phone with Marvel before going downstairs with Giselle. Because the curtains were drawn, the outdoor sunlight didn't shine into the room. The living room, which was still lit by the wall lamp, was very messy. A group of almost naked girls were lying on the sofa and carpet. Some were hugging pillows, some were hugging each other, all sleeping soundly. Looking at the situation in the living room, Giselle remembered that she was carried to the bedroom by Eric alone last night. A faint sense of superiority grew in Giselle, and her original vigilance dissipated a lot. Since Eric didn't do anything out of line last night, he naturally wouldn't do anything today. What's more, she had just satisfied Eric. Putting down her guard, Giselle was also a lot more considerate. She quietly walked through the living room with Eric and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. However, just as she put the bread into the spit, Giselle remembered something and said, "Eric, you lost 8 times last night. Do you really want to?" Eric held a pan and carefully fried the eggs. He smiled and said, "Do you want me to go back on my word? That's $800,000, and a private jet." Giselle felt a little pain when she thought about it. Because of Eric's support, she had earned more than $100,000 in the past half a year. However, after deducting the various agent commissions and taxes, plus her and Alexander's expenses, there was nothing left. Not to mention the equally expensive private jet, $800,000, whether in the past or now, was a huge sum of money that she could only dream of. Eric put the fried eggs on the plate, cracked 2 more, and continued, "Here, I'll give you a math problem. 987 minus 677, the result is divided by 365. How much is it?" Giselle thought of Fernanda Tavares last night and turned her little head, but she had no clue. She was not that good at math. However, the girl was unwilling to admit defeat, so she put down the milk carton in her hand and walked to the fridge to pick up the paper and pen hanging by the side to calculate. She quickly turned her head and said, "About 0.85? Eric watched Giselle's movements with a smile and said, "That's right. My net worth 2 years ago was $67. 7 billion, and last year it was $98. 7,365 days a year. So, what is the result of your calculation?" Giselle immediately opened her mouth in surprise. That means you can earn $85 million a day." "Yes, $85 million a day, $3. 5 million an hour, $60,000 a minute. Let me calculate. It will take about 13 minutes to earn $800,000, so I can still afford the bet." Giselle felt a little dizzy. "This is too exaggerated." Eric smiled and put another fried egg on the plate. He said, "Come baby, try the fried egg I made in 3 minutes. How does it taste? It's very expensive." Eric's little joke made Giselle sober up a little. She tried not to think about the series of numbers that made her feel powerless. She walked over and picked up a piece of fried egg with a fork, put it in her mouth, and deliberately frowned. "It's a little salty. Do you want me to make another 6-minute one?" "Hee, that will definitely be burnt." They chatted and laughed as they prepared breakfast. Instead of going to the dining room, they went to the bar by the window in the living room. They opened the curtains a little and sat on the high stools to eat together. Perhaps it was because there was more light in the room, or perhaps it was the stimulation of the smell of food, but a girl lying on the carpet closer to them woke up in a daze. It was Chu Si Goff. The girl sat up, shook her head, and looked down at her chest in a daze. She reached out and peeled off a piece of paper, and subconsciously put it in her mouth to suck it. The paper was stuck on with the cream from the cake Eric had brought last night. It was very sweet. The unique bitterness in her mouth after a hangover dissipated, and Chu Si Goff was much more awake. She sniffled and turned to look in the direction of the bar. Eric happened to be sitting across from the living room, and he greeted her. "Good morning, Chu Si. Do you want to eat something?" After waking up, it was impossible for her to be as crazy as last night. However, looking around at her companions who were in similar situations, Chu Si Goff did not feel too embarrassed. Smiling shyly, Chu Si Goff peeled off all the pieces of paper that were still stuck on her body. She casually picked up a dress next to her and put it on before walking over to greet them. "Good morning, Eric. Giselle." Eric gestured for the girl to sit opposite Giselle and pushed the milk in his hand over. "If you don't mind, drink this glass of milk first. It's been warmed." Stimulated by the smell of food, Chu Si Goff felt her little stomach turn empty. Of course, she did not mind. After thanking him, she picked up Eric's milk and sipped it in small mouthfuls. Seeing that Eric gave his milk to Chu Si Goff, Giselle took the initiative to run to the kitchen to prepare a new one for him. After drinking the milk, Chu Si Goff felt much better in her stomach. She looked up at Eric and smiled. "Eric, can I take a shower?" "Of course, the bathroom is over there." Eric pointed. Chu Si Goff thanked him and got up to walk to the bathroom. After taking a quick shower, Chu Si Goff came out of the bathroom and saw that Eric had already eaten breakfast. He was sitting at the bar with a pen in his hand, writing something. After walking closer, Chu Si Goff realized that it was a check. Recalling what happened last night, Chu Si Goff's heart suddenly beat faster. Eric had lost 8 times last night. That was $800,000. Even if the 14 girls split it equally, each of them would get more than $50,000. More than $50,000. Oh, and there was also a private jet and a worldwide shopping trip. When Eric proposed this bet, she and most of the other girls did not have much hope that Eric would honor the bet. Especially after Eric gradually lost 8 times, they did not have much hope. In their usual way of thinking, they did not think that anyone would easily fork out $800,000. Thinking of this, Chu Si Goff tiptoed closer to the bar, trying to make herself invisible. However, her eyes drifted over to the numbers that Eric was filling in. 1 0, 2 zeros, 3 zeros. Hey, why was the number at the beginning 1? It should have been 8. After Eric finished filling in the check, he looked up at Chu Si Goff and smiled. He tore off the check and handed it to Giselle. "Here, take the extra as pocket money for you and Alexander. Here's my assistant's business card. Give him a call and he'll arrange a private jet for you. You can go anywhere you want." Giselle held the check in her hand and looked at the string of zeros. Her eyes were also sparkling. However, she hesitated and said, "But, Eric, the company probably won't allow us to go on a holiday. We still have work to do. It's not the fashion season now. How can there be so much work? Just say what I said. It's the holidays, so I won't be working. If anyone disagrees, get John Casablanca of Elite and, who's the president of IMG? Get them to call me." Eric put away the checkbook, got up, and hugged Giselle. He glanced at the girls who were still sleeping in the living room and smiled. "Then I'll go to work. Also, you're the big sister, so keep an eye on them. No matter where they go, don't go too crazy." Chapter 852. Last night's indulgence was just a small change in Eric's busy work. He didn't mind signing the $1 million check. After all, just like the math problem he gave Giselle, compared to his current wealth, $1 million was the same as $1 for an ordinary person. However, this check was a completely different concept for the girls. After sending Eric out of the apartment, Chu Si-goff immediately turned to Giselle and looked at the check in her hand expectantly. She couldn't help but reach out her small hand and said, "Giselle, it's really $1 million, can you let me see?" Giselle pushed away Chu Si-goff's hand and said, "Of course it's real. Would Eric sign a fake check for me?" Chu Si-goff didn't dare to snatch it back. She returned to the bar by the window, but she didn't forget to correct Giselle, "This is for all of us." Giselle sat down at the bar again and shook her head. "No, 800,000 belongs to all of us. The other 200,000 is my and Aile's pocket money. You just heard." Chu Si-goff rolled her eyes and asked, "You and Aile want to share the 800,000 with us?" "Of course," Giselle said. "We played games last night." While the two were talking, another girl opened her eyes and sat up. When she saw the check in Giselle's hand, she screamed excitedly and all the girls woke up. They didn't even have time to put on their clothes. They all gathered around Giselle and began to talk. "Wow, 1 million. Eric really redeemed the bet. How much can each of us get? There's a shopping trip, right? What about the private jet?" "Stupid, of course the private jet is at the airport. It can't be parked in the house." Giselle looked at the group of chattering girls and suddenly remembered Eric's last words. Because she just debuted, even with Eric's support, she couldn't reach the top of the industry. From the few contacts she had, she realized that the successful supermodel circles like Cindy Crawford and Linda Evangelista wouldn't accept them. Most of the girls around her were of similar age. They could be said to be a group of newcomers with more potential in the industry. This was why they could hang out together. In this case, why didn't she establish her own circle? And of course, she had to be the big sister that Eric talked about. As long as Eric supported her, her future development would definitely not be limited to just being a supermodel. Then, the girls around her would definitely become her helpers. After a quick calculation, Giselle reached out and patted the bar counter. She glanced around and raised her voice. "Okay, everyone shut up." Giselle's eyes were filled with the aura she usually had when she was disciplining Alexander. The girls paused for a moment, and as expected, they all tactfully stopped talking. Giselle was satisfied with the effect. She said, $800,000 for a trip around the world on a private jet. Eric promised to honor it. If everyone's passports are fine, we can go anywhere in the afternoon. In the soft cheers, Giselle continued, "But you should know the rules. First of all, no one is allowed to talk about what happened last night. Otherwise, believe me, Eric just needs to make a phone call and the agency will immediately terminate your contract. Your career will also end here." Although they felt that Giselle was a bit intimidating, the girls still nodded obediently. Even though they weren't old, they were able to get contracts with international modeling giants like Elite and IMG. This group of girls certainly weren't inexperienced. If word got out about what had happened last night, it wouldn't do them any good. After all, the models who had dared to jump out and expose things had all disappeared without a trace. However, someone immediately objected, "Giselle, if we don't say anything, the company won't allow us to travel." This was indeed a problem. Giselle thought for a moment and had a bold idea. She said, "How about this? I'll personally call the company's boss and talk to them. As long as they arrange it, even the agents directly responsible for us can't ask anything." "Giselle, will the bosses listen to you?" "Of course," Eric said before he left that if they don't agree, he will directly ask. Giselle nodded with certainty. She saw that the girls were still hesitant. She also knew that the management of the agency was probably the unreachable controller of the entire industry in their eyes, but she was too lazy to explain. From Eric's interest in her and Alessandra, the two big agencies' almost protective reaction to the two of them, it could be seen how much influence Eric had. For example, the Victoria's Secret show had become a training ground for supermodels. Any modeling agency that wanted to send their models to the Victoria's Secret show had to go through Eric's test. "Giselle, can I get my share of the money directly? I mean, I'm short of money recently, and I still owe rent." The girl's voice was a little low, with a little uncertainty. It was Fernanda Tavares. Giselle was already very dissatisfied with her taking the initiative to attract Eric's attention last night. She said, "Of course, I'll give you your share, but you can't travel around the world with us." Fernanda Tavares felt Giselle's dissatisfaction with her, but if she was kicked out of the circle, her loss would obviously be greater, so she decisively shook her head and said, "Forget it, I don't want it." Giselle was stunned. Then she smiled and showed her generosity at the right time. Smart choice. The girls who originally had similar thoughts heard the conversation between the two and dismissed the idea. More than $50,000 in cash was of course a huge sum of money for them now. If they could get it, they would never spend it all in one go. But they were still young. Between money and opportunities, they certainly knew how to choose. Seeing that no one had any more questions, Giselle sniffled and pulled a few pieces of paper from Fernanda's naked chest in disgust. She pinched them and said, "You guys look and smell like a group of natives who just ran out of the Amazon jungle. Go take a shower and clean this place up." There were always a lot of bathrooms in Western-style apartments. The girls finally realized their embarrassment at this time. They laughed and quickly got into different bathrooms. After confirming her status as the big sister, Giselle was very satisfied. She picked up the phone on the bar, found the address book, and began to dial the numbers of the bosses of the agencies. Because of work, the girls basically had multinational passports. They flew to Tokyo in the afternoon. Of course, they were definitely first selected by Giselle. Although compared to ordinary people, the girls had more opportunities to go abroad, they were basically working in fashion shows during the fashion season. Under the company's arrangement, they would be busy for more than 10 hours a day. Then they would be so tired that they would fall asleep as soon as they hit the bed. They had no intention of traveling at all. This was the first time they could indulge to their heart's content. Eric had a rough idea of what had happened from John Casabianca, the CEO of Elite, on the phone, but he just smiled and brushed it off. He originally wanted to use a week to confirm the specific plan for Marvel Pictures, but it turned out that a week was not enough. There were too many things to discuss. Marvel Pictures was related to the movie layout of Firefly for at least the next 20 years. Eric did not want to make a hasty decision on any matter. Therefore, he stayed in New York until late April. On the other hand, the two teams of Firefly Electronics and Amazon were very efficient. 3 days after the hunger marketing plan was confirmed, the plan officially began to be implemented. Due to the limited production capacity and booming sales, the price of the Firefly player in physical retail stores had basically risen to $329. This was the rule that Firefly Electronics had set after they stopped supplying to several retail stores that had raised the price without hesitation. Even so, the Firefly in physical retail stores was still in a state of short supply. In this case, Amazon sold 5,000 units of Firefly at the original price of $299 every 3 days. This immediately attracted the attention of a large number of consumers. According to Yahoo statistics, at the beginning of 1997, the number of Internet users in North America who used online payment services had reached 5 million. Although it was still insignificant compared to the total number of Internet users, this number was still unmatched by any other overseas region. Therefore, the first round of Amazon sales campaign only took 2.5 hours. 5,000 units of Firefly were sold out. With the joint efforts of several companies, a large number of media outlets in North America reported on this. Then, the second round of sales was shortened by half. The third round was shortened to 10 minutes. Hunger marketing was not a novel marketing method, but this was definitely the first time it was put on the table on a large scale and became a social topic. With the help of this hot topic, more and more people, regardless of whether they were interested in the Firefly or not, inevitably noticed this epic-making music player product. The potential consumers who were still in a wait-and-see state also joined in the rush to buy this product. When the fourth round of Firefly sales began, there was only 1 minute left in the entire process. Amazon's online store page even began to lag due to the influx of customers. The popularity of online sales also stimulated physical sales. Although the price was $30 higher than the Amazon store, due to the scarcity of the product, most retail stores sold out almost immediately after they put the new Fireflyer on the shelves. Unsurprisingly, a large number of scalpers appeared. Immediately, some media outlets began to suspect that this was a joint effort between Amazon and Firefly Electronics. The online store's sales volume was far lower than what was announced to the public. Amazon quickly clarified. Without disclosing customer privacy, they directly posted the transaction records of each purchase on the website's homepage. The situation of Fireflyer being out of stock inevitably caused some users to dislike it. Firefly Electronics spared no effort in public relations. Not only did they explain the cause and effect of Fireflyer's production capacity limitations in detail on the Yahoo portal, but they even opened a dedicated product homepage to report the construction progress of Fireflyer's new factory and other product-related news to users in real time. From time to time, they would also have some interesting and rewarding interactions with fans. Under this close and tacit cooperation, Fireflyer's brand image became deeply ingrained in the hearts of consumers step by step. Amazon also became the biggest external beneficiary of this process. Due to the popularity of hunger marketing, Amazon's average traffic increased by 50% in just 2 weeks. Jeff Bezos decisively changed his original plan and took advantage of this opportunity to introduce more product types. In addition to Firefly Electronics and Amazon, the online music store that Yahoo was in charge of also achieved impressive sales results. Even without Fireflyer, the purchased music could be played directly on the personal computer. It even had the ability to burn music. Therefore, after Yahoo Music Store and Fireflyer started sales at the same time, with a digital soundtrack of Titanic and albums by popular singers such as Superboy and Madonna, it only took 5 days for Yahoo Music Store to sell a total of 1 million songs. This data far exceeded everyone's expectations in the industry. Before this, even the boldest prediction said that it would take at least 2 months for Yahoo Music Store to achieve the first 1 million song sales. But in fact, this process only took 5 days. At this sales rate, Yahoo Music Store could achieve at least $70 million in sales revenue in the first year. It had to be said that this data was very obvious in driving the overall revenue of Yahoo. After all, before the IPO, Yahoo definitely needed a more beautiful annual financial report. The sales data of Yahoo Music Store far exceeded expectations. The most nervous were undoubtedly the major record companies. Although the CD-ROM drive on personal computers had also just appeared, the CD burning function provided by Yahoo Music Box software was almost equivalent to directly destroying the original ecology of the record industry. Before this, the average price of a music album in the market was about $20, but Yahoo Music Store reduced this price by half at once. Even according to the sharing rules, the product companies received a share of about $7 per digital album from Yahoo Music Store, which was not much less than the profit obtained from selling a physical product. But the major record companies were still on high alert. 2 weeks after Sony issued that statement at the beginning of the month, Sony Records, together with 2 other record giants, BMG and EMI, filed a lawsuit in the San Francisco federal court to ban the production and sales of MP3 players on the grounds of encouraging the spread of pirated music. Chapter 853. Eric spent the past 2 weeks in frequent meetings with Marvel's management. During this time, Katzenberg personally came to New York to participate in several more important meetings. After repeated discussions during this period, the company preliminarily determined the basic structure of Marvel Pictures and the movie development plan. Marvel Pictures would be completely independent of Firefly Corporation's film and television production system. Together with the planned future Marvel Television Production Company, they would be responsible for the development of all superhero films and television works under Marvel Entertainment. At the same time, Eric would personally serve as the producer of all Marvel's movies in the first stage to ensure the smooth implementation of the plan. In terms of movie production, Marvel Pictures would largely imitate the standardized industrial process of the era of major Hollywood studios. All production personnel such as producers, directors, actors, and so on had to follow Marvel's overall style and will. In order to implement cost control as much as possible and maintain the sustainability of the serialized comic film development plan, all the core characters in Marvel Pictures movies had to sign long-term packaging contracts. At the same time, Eric no longer pursued the radical strategy of Marvel movies. In the preliminary movie universe plan, only the Avengers storyline was confirmed for the time being. As for projects such as X-Men and Fantastic Four, Eric decided to wait for the Avengers plan to be successfully implemented before Marvel movies gained enough influence to start the production of other series. In the original spacetime, it was the great success of Marvel's Avengers plan that completely activated all of Marvel's IP and led all of Marvel's superhero brands to enter the heyday. Before that, other than Sony's Spider-Man, the other Marvel movies could not be considered too successful. This was especially so for the X-Men series. In Eric's opinion, the X-Men series, which had a large number of rich characters, was completely messed up by Fox. The characters were not focused, the timeline was messy, and most of the sequels in the entire series only returned to the original line. Firefly would definitely not be able to dig out the gold mine of Marvel. Eric would still adopt the strategy of cooperating with other studios. However, the premise of all this was that Marvel Pictures still had to have enough control over the project development and more profit sharing. However, even if Firefly had a close relationship with Fox and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the cooperation between the parties would not be so smooth if they could not prove the huge potential of Marvel superheroes. Therefore, the success or failure of the Avengers became the key to the development of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Firefly had signed a contract with Cameron for Spider-Man. Due to the success of Titanic, using Cameron as the director of Spider-Man seemed to go against the production principles that Marvel Pictures had just established. However, that was not the case. Cameron was the kind of technical commercial film director who paid attention to the visual sense of the film. The films he directed had always focused on the story and not the artistry. The positioning of Marvel movies was also a popcorn movie that relied on superhero IP and movie special effects. Both sides were almost in agreement. Of course, with Cameron, it would be impossible to control the cost of Spider-Man, but compared to the profits that Cameron might bring in, these were still acceptable. However, there were also some disadvantages. That was, in the future, people would definitely credit the success of Spider-Man to Cameron. Therefore, in order to prove the commercial potential of Marvel superheroes, Marvel Pictures must produce a standard Marvel superhero movie according to the established plan while shooting Spider-Man. As for which superhero to choose, Eric naturally did not need any hesitation. Tony Stark is a very anti-mainstream superhero. He is conceited, arrogant, and crazy. At the same time, he is also a genius, an inventor, a billionaire, a playboy, and other identities. This is a very malleable character. As long as he is played properly, he will definitely be very charming on the big screen. During the meeting at Marvel headquarters, Eric summarized his views, looked away from the memo in front of him, looked up at the crowd, and continued, "Moreover, Iron Man is still a second-tier hero. If the movie is successful, it will undoubtedly prove the great value of Marvel superhero characters. I am very confident in this project. Moreover, even if it does fail unexpectedly, it will not have much impact on the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe system. We still have many first-tier characters to try." As he spoke, Eric felt that everyone was looking at him strangely, especially Stan Lee, who was next to him. The old man squinted his eyes and smiled wretchedly. Subconsciously touching his cheek, Eric wondered, "Why are you looking at me like that?" Everyone had an inexplicable smile on their faces. Stan Lee said, "Eric, according to the setting of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Tony Stark was born in 1969. According to the original comic, Tony Stark was born in the 1940s. According to the principle that the timeline of the movie and reality roughly coincided, he should be in his 50s now. This would definitely not work, so a new setting had to be made. In other words, the new Iron Man would be much younger than the Tony Stark version in his previous life. According to the planned release date around 2000, the new Tony Stark would be around 30 years old, which was undoubtedly the most attractive period for men." Eric nodded doubtfully. He had read the movie universe plan drawn up by Marvel's creative department many times in detail, and had also provided a lot of suggestions based on his memory. Of course, he was aware of this point. Seeing Eric nod, Stan Lee continued to guide him with a smile. "So, Eric, you see, you were born in 1970. It's only a few days apart, right?" Eric immediately understood Stan Lee's intention and shook his head without hesitation. "Don't even think about it, Stan." Stan Lee was unwilling to give up so easily and said, "Eric, don't be so hasty to refuse. Everyone knows that my inspiration for Tony Stark came from Howard Hughes. You're exactly the same as him. No, 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 you're better than him. So, why don't you try this role? It's practically tailor-made for you. Come on, Stan. My salary is now $60,000 per minute. I can't even afford it myself, so don't even think about it." Hey, see, conceited, arrogant, and a little crazy. Stan Lee smiled even more wretchedly like a big bad wolf. "So, Eric, you're Tony Stark. Otherwise, you wouldn't have chosen this superhero in the first place. Well, how about this?" Eric didn't intend to pay attention to the old man's nagging anymore. He closed the folder in front of him and said, "In the future, when you advertise, you can use the title Eric Williams once wanted to play Iron Man himself, but was strongly opposed by Stan Lee, as a gimmick. Forget about the rest." Everyone laughed. Stan Lee didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Eric, you're twisting the truth." "Of course I'm twisting the truth. Who would be interested in normal news? That's settled. I'll return to Los Angeles next week to start the preliminary preparations for the movie. I'll give you a month to come up with the first version of the script. That's it, meeting adjourned." Eric made the final decision, and everyone knew that the matter they were secretly discussing was definitely not going to happen. Everyone, who had been looking forward to it, sighed in disappointment and got up to leave the conference room one after another. It wasn't that Eric was completely uninterested in playing Iron Man. However, once he did so, this superhero movie would definitely become his plaything in the eyes of the audience. This was definitely not a good thing and would be very detrimental to the layout of the entire Avengers plan. After comforting the disappointed Stan Lee, Eric stayed at the Marvel headquarters until it was time to get off work before leaving the office with Avi Allard. When he came to the underground parking lot of the office building, Eric saw the gorgeous fiery red Maserati next to his car and Cindy Crawford, who was leaning against the car and waving at him with a smile. Perhaps it was because her career had been revitalized in recent years. The supermodel who had just turned 30 years old looked even more radiant. Avi Allard glanced at Cindy Crawford with envy in his eyes. Then, he took the initiative to leave. Eric walked over and touched the hood of the Maserati. He smiled and said, "Nice car." Cindy was wearing a black windbreaker and high boots. A light-colored scarf was tied around her fair neck. She struck a pose and asked, "Where is she?" "Even prettier." Eric smiled and hugged Cindy. Instead of getting into his black Bentley, he got into the passenger seat of the Maserati. Cindy wanted to get into Eric's car, but seeing him get into her car, she turned to the driver's seat and got into the car. She started the engine and looked at Eric leaning comfortably in the passenger seat. She suggested with interest, "Why don't you drive?" Eric smiled and said, "I'm more suited to driving a Hummer now, and it has to be a military one." "Why?" "This way, I'll have an advantage when I hit something." Haha. Cindy smiled and understood that Eric must have rarely driven himself now. She didn't mention this topic anymore. She started the car and slowly drove out of the parking lot before saying, "I made a reservation at Jean Georges. Let's go eat first?" Eric nodded. "Okay, I'll listen to your arrangements tonight." Cindy complained, "It's so hard to ask you out. You made me wait for 2 weeks." Being in New York, Eric inevitably received all kinds of party invitations from local tyrants. He could turn down most of them, but there were some he couldn't. These days, he had to entertain almost every night. It was also because they were about to leave that Eric had the time to spare. Hearing Cindy's slightly bitter tone, Eric smiled and said, "You're in such a hurry to ask me out. Don't you have a new boyfriend yet? This isn't your style." Cindy turned the steering wheel and looked at him. "Don't you want me to be single forever? I want you to get married. That's more exciting." "Damn man." Cindy rolled her eyes and said, "I tried dating someone, but I felt it was too boring. We broke up at the end of last year." "Haha, it seems that your horizons have widened," Eric joked with a smile. In his memory, Cindy had passed the peak of her modeling career. During this period of time, she worked in Hollywood on Fair Game, which didn't cause any waves. So, she quickly settled down and married a nightclub owner in New York and had children. Compared to most supermodels who couldn't settle down until they lost their glory, Cindy was probably a winner in life. But now, because of Eric's appearance, Cindy's life trajectory completely deviated from her previous life. A series of identities such as the spokesperson of Victoria's Secret and the producer and host of America's Top Model also revitalized her career. Her current annual income was not much worse than those A-list Hollywood actresses. Correspondingly, her heart was destined to not settle down easily. The two arrived at Jean-Georges Restaurant on Fifth Avenue. After they sat down and ordered, they casually chatted about recent events. After the waiter left with the dishes, Sinclair said casually, "I also bought a Fireflyer recently. My assistant got it from the black market for $400. I didn't expect the little thing you made to be treated as a contraband." This was the first time Eric heard of this. He smiled and said, "You should have said so earlier. I'll get someone to give you a few. I wouldn't dare trouble you with such a small thing." Cindy smiled and said, "I saw yesterday that Firefly Electronics was sued." "Yeah, Chris already flew to San Francisco to deal with it. It's not a big problem." "I think so too." Cindy nodded and said, "I read the article. It said that the record company's revenue from Yahoo Music is not much different from physical records. Because of the convenience of the internet, if online music stores are developed, record companies can earn more revenue. So why are they still so aggressive?" "This is just the surface." Eric did not know why Cindy was suddenly interested in this kind of thing, but he still explained, "The annual revenue of the music industry alone is not more than $20 billion. This is why the major record companies are basically dependent on large corporations. The market capacity is there, and it's impossible to do big business." However, the music player market was much larger, and it also involved the issue of patent monopoly. Traditional portable music player patents were basically in the hands of Japanese manufacturers. The licensing fee for a complete set of music player patents was usually not less than 5% of the overall price of the music player. Based on this alone, Japanese companies could earn more than $1 billion in net income every year. The emergence of the Fireflyer is tantamount to completely breaking the patent monopoly of traditional portable music player manufacturers. Once the Fireflyer becomes popular, the Walkman and other devices will be eliminated. The Japanese manufacturers' patents worth tens of billions of USD will be worthless. That's why their reaction is so aggressive. Chapter 854. Cindy sighed and said, "Tens of billions of USD. I think they will definitely fight the lawsuit for this. I saw in yesterday's article that Sony fought with Disney and Universal over the video recorder for 10 years. Eric smiled and said, "You must be reading the kind of newspaper that likes to exaggerate things to attract attention." They did not mention the most important point, which is that the Sony VCR case is very favorable to Fireflyer. Also, if Fireflyer becomes popular, it will provide a lot of tax revenue and jobs for the federal government. Do you think the federal court will help the Japanese suppress their potential taxpayers? Local protectionism existed in any country and region. If the core patents of traditional portable music players were in the hands of American companies, Firefly Electronics might have encountered some trouble because of the huge interest entanglement of tens of billions of dollars. However, these patents happen to be in the hands of the Japanese. Even traditional music player manufacturers in the United States had to pay a large sum of patent licensing fees to Japanese companies every year. In this case, it would be a miracle if the federal court in San Francisco would help the Japanese. Chris had mentioned in the recent calls from San Francisco that the federal court in San Francisco would most likely reject the lawsuit filed by Sony and the other two major record labels and would not file a case. Cindy tilted her head slightly and listened quietly. She then asked with interest, "What's the case law?" "You won't be interested." Eric shook his head and smiled at Cindy. "I'm curious, why are you suddenly asking about this?" "Actually, it's like this." Cindy did not show any embarrassment when Eric saw through her. She said seriously, "Didn't you suggest that I invest in technology stocks last year?" That's why I'm paying attention to this information. Eric understood and smiled. You really bought it? Cindy waved her two slender fingers and said, $20 million, all for the 4 stocks you mentioned to me last year. Eric could not remember the details, so he asked, which 4 stocks? It's AOL, Microsoft, Cisco, and Intel, Cindy said. Her eyes suddenly widened. Oh my God, you forgot, that's most of my savings. Eric quickly gestured. Don't be so surprised, and you must have made a lot of money, right? Sinclair also realized that he was overreacting. Due to their status, there were already many customers looking in their direction, and now, a lot of people were looking at them openly. Cindy took a sip of red wine and said excitedly, yeah, it's crazy. These stocks have more than doubled in a year. Now, the value of my stocks is close to $50 million. I never thought I'd have so much money. Eric actually felt the same way. The Clover Fund had been continuously investing money in the Nasdaq market, and the current book income was even more amazing than the small plate in Cindy's hands. So? Eric asked with a smile. He knew that Cindy would not mention this for no reason. Cindy did not beat around the bush. She slowly cut the cod on her plate and said, recently, my stockbroker suggested that I liquidate all my stocks as soon as possible, but I'm not sure, so I wanted to ask for your opinion first. Eric asked, did the stockbroker explain why? I mean, why did he suddenly suggest that you liquidate your stocks? Yeah, Cindy nodded and said, he said that the economic crisis in Southeast Asia might affect North America, causing the Nasdaq market to collapse. The Nasdaq index was currently close to 1,500 points, which was almost double of 3 years ago. Therefore, the investment market had long been bearish on the Nasdaq index. Eric was probably the only person in the world who was 100% sure that the Nasdaq index was far from reaching its limit. However, if Cindy's stockbroker used the reason that the Nasdaq index was too high to persuade her to sell her stocks, Eric would not be surprised. It was very common for stockbrokers to encourage their clients to frequently buy and sell stocks to earn more commissions. However, the stockbroker used the reason that the economic crisis in Southeast Asia might affect North America. Eric thought for a bit and said, Cindy, I don't know how good your stockbroker skills are. But if it were me, I would definitely do the same. Cindy blinked and asked the same question as Eric. Then what? Eric took a sip of red wine and said, now, no one can be sure if the Southeast Asian economy will really experience a crisis. Therefore, if this prediction is true, I will definitely become a stockbroker with foresight in your eyes, and you will trust me more in the future. In this case, if the North American stock market is not affected and continues to surge, I just need to give you a reasonable reason, and you will definitely continue to listen to my advice and buy again. This way, you will get 2 commissions. Cindy obviously could not keep up with Eric's train of thought. She thought for a long time, and when Eric finished the last bit of food on his plate, she finally figured out something and said, You're saying that the guy deliberately lied to me? Eric shrugged and said, It's just a possibility. I don't know your stockbroker. Maybe he is really thinking about his clients. Who knows? But, Cindy moved the cutlery in her hand and said, You just said that the economic crisis in Southeast Asia will happen, but it won't affect the North American stock market, right? But that doesn't seem to make sense. Although I don't know much about these things, I also think that it will have an impact. Eric said, Of course it will have an impact, but the impact is exactly the opposite of what your stockbroker described. Let's put it this way, do you know the biggest impact of the 2 world wars on the global economic landscape? Cindy shook her head and said, I don't know. I'm not interested in things like war. Eric said helplessly, Didn't you go to university? Cindy raised her beautiful face and said, Of course, Northwest University of China Chemical Engineering. Although I only studied for a year, I still remember the molecular formula of water. HO2, right? Okay, the water you drink is really special. Eric did not know if this little minx was maliciously acting cute. He decided not to talk about the heavy topic of hydrogen dioxide. Instead, he continued, the biggest impact of the 2 world wars on the global economy was the collapse of Europe, which contributed to the rise of the Federation. Similarly, Once the Southeast Asian currency system was attacked and caused an economic crisis, the impact was tantamount to a large-scale war. When the emerging economies of the Southeast Asian countries were destroyed, the original capital would definitely choose to escape. Due to the generally high welfare and low-efficiency social system in Europe, coupled with the fact that European countries could almost never achieve integration, it was difficult to attract capital. In this case, North America would once again become the best destination for capital to escape. The most direct manifestation of a large influx of capital would be the arrival of the stock market bull market. So, this is just the beginning. Cindy understood this time. She nodded and said, "It seems like I need to change my stockbroker. But, Eric, can I continue to buy now? Also, when do you think is a good time to sell these shares?" "Of course, it's a good time to sell." Eric thought for a while and said, "Yahoo's listing will definitely bring the Nasdaq to a high point. You can start to sell at that time. Don't enter the market after that." In his memory, the Nasdaq stock market collapsed in March 2000. However, since he personally created a group of butterflies, Eric was certain that the Nasdaq index would not follow the original historical trajectory. Yahoo would probably go public between the end of 1998 and the beginning of 1999. As the most high-profile internet technology company, Yahoo's listing would definitely drive the entire stock market up. It was indeed a good time to sell. The shares in Cindy's hands would definitely have appreciated several times by then. There was no need to be too greedy. As for the shares held by the Clover Fund, Eric had a more detailed plan, but he definitely could not reveal this to Cindy. Cindy also saw that Eric was holding back. Although she wanted to know when Yahoo would go public, she also understood the principle of not going too far. She was smart enough not to continue asking. The two of them were almost done with their food. It was still early, so Cindy did not intend to leave. She ordered coffee and continued to chat with Eric. Although she could not keep up with Eric's thoughts most of the time, Cindy also understood that the information she could get from Eric was 100 times better than those guys who only knew how to talk. Others might be infatuated with her beauty, but this trick hardly worked on Eric. It would only become more and more difficult to ask this man out in the future. She cherished this opportunity very much. Cindy added a cube of sugar into the hot coffee and gently stirred it. She then remembered something and asked, "Speaking of which, Eric, will you still be in New York at the beginning of next month?" Today was already April 25th, Friday. Eric planned to return to East Hampton on the weekend and fly directly from there to Los Angeles next week. He shook his head and said, "No, I'm leaving in 2 days." "Why?" Cindy said with some regret, "There's a Met ball on the 5th of next month. I was wondering if I could invite you to be my male partner." Eric also remembered. The full name of the Met Ball was the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art Charity Ball. It was a charity party that Anna Wintour personally organized to compete with the West Coast Vanity Fair party. Only the most popular celebrities of each year were invited to attend. Last weekend, when he attended the Hearst family's cocktail party, Anna Wintour, who happened to be there, asked if he was interested. Eric smiled and said, "Even if I have time, I definitely can't be your male partner. Drew will definitely come to join in the fun." Everyone knew that Eric and Drew had an extremely close relationship. Cindy had met Drew a few times. She definitely did not dare to compete with Drew because she always felt that behind that baby face, there was a crazy factor that could instantly turn on everyone. If she and Drew had a conflict, Cindy was sure that Eric would not help her. When Cindy thought of this, she couldn't help but be curious. "Eric, what's your relationship with Drew?" Eric did not avoid this question and replied, "It's the kind of relationship you think it is. A tree and a vine, entangled together. No one can leave the other." Cindy didn't know why, but she felt a strong sense of jealousy when she saw the scene that Eric had outlined with a few simple words. "Then, does she not mind that you go on a date with us?" "Of course she minds, but her outlook on life is different from other people," Eric replied. He then smiled at Cindy and asked, "Do you want to know what's different?" Cindy instinctively shook her head and said, "No." "Oh," Eric smiled. Just as he was about to say something, he felt the phone in his pocket vibrate. He took it out and gestured to Cindy. He then got up and walked to the corridor not far away to pick up the phone. The call was from Los Angeles. The two talked for about 10 minutes. Eric returned to his seat, looked at his watch, and said to Cindy, "We might have to leave early." Cindy automatically forgot about the topic that she regretted just now. She asked with concern, "Did something happen?" Eric called the waiter and handed him his credit card. He then said to Cindy, "It's nothing serious. Today is Friday. The global box office data for the 18th week of Titanic is out. Los Angeles just sent the data over. I want to go back and take a look." "Wow, it's already the 18th week." Cindy was immediately interested. She said, "I remember last week it was, $1. 75 billion. This is a miracle. How much is it now?" $1. 852 billion. Eric reported a number. He was not so calm because this number meant that Titanic had successfully broken the box office record of $1. 840 billion in the first round of screenings in his previous life. It was still sprinting towards the new record of $2 billion. Katzenberg just said on the phone that according to the current box office curve of Titanic, there was no doubt that the global box office would reach $2 billion. The only thing that was uncertain was how far the final potential would go. A month ago, when the global box office of Titanic exceeded $1.5 billion, the company's executives suggested holding a grand celebration party, but Eric rejected it. He preferred to celebrate after the global box office exceeded $1.8 billion, which was a more special goal. In the phone call just now, Eric and Katzenberg had agreed to hold a grand celebration party next Wednesday in the preliminary model of Titanic at Firefly Studios. At the same time, they would officially announce the Titanic theme exhibition to the public. Chapter 855. Eric took Cindy back to his apartment on 6th Avenue. It was just past 8 o'clock in the evening. Cindy followed behind Eric and looked around the living room. She said, "I don't know why, but it feels weird that you're living here alone." Eric took off his jacket and hung it on the hanger. He walked over to the round table next to the window and sat down. He turned on the computer and asked, "What's weird about it?" Cindy also hung up her windbreaker and sat on the stairs. She took off her high boots and pondered for a moment before she asked, "Don't you feel lonely?" Eric typed in the password and said, "If I remember correctly, you live alone too, right?" "I think so." Cindy was still thinking about it. She put away her tall boots and walked to the wine cabinet in the corner of the living room. She picked up a bottle of whiskey and said, "It's really strange. I feel completely different when you live alone compared to when I live alone." "Interesting, let me know when you figure it out," said Eric. He felt like this topic was familiar, but he didn't want to dwell on it. He logged on to his work email and opened the box office data for Titanic from Los Angeles. Cindy tilted her head and opened the small fridge absent-mindedly. She didn't forget to ask, "Do you want ice?" "Actually, I don't like to drink." "That's a waste. You have enough alcohol in your freezer to buy a nice house in Manhattan," said Cindy. She didn't ask for Eric's opinion. She added ice and walked over with 2 glasses of whiskey. Cindy placed a glass of wine next to Eric's hand, pulled a chair over, and asked, "May I take a look?" The email contained detailed box office data for Titanic in the past few weeks. Most of it would appear on the public media, so there was no need to keep it a secret. Eric nodded and moved aside. He picked up the glass of whiskey and took a sip. Cindy was quite happy to get Eric's permission. However, when she saw that the 12-inch laptop screen was filled with dense data tables and text, she suddenly felt a little dizzy and lost all interest. After patiently accompanying Eric for a while, Cindy stood up and said, "I want to take a shower." "Eric, do you want to come with me?" Eric patted Cindy's hand on his shoulder and said, "You go first, I'll wait for a while." After Cindy left, Eric looked at the laptop screen again. Titanic began to decline after the global box office reached an unprecedented peak during the week of the Oscars. In the 15th week of its release in North America, due to the lack of popularity, the box office quickly fell below $20 million, reaching $18 million. The overseas box office also did not break $200 million in a single week. Compared to the $236 million in the 14th week, the overall overseas box office fell by 25% in the 15th week, earning another $177 million. In the next few weeks, the drop in the North American box office began to increase. In the last week, the domestic box office reached $571 million, but the box office also fell below the $10 million mark, earning only $9.3 million. However, the drop in the box office in the overseas market remained at a relatively weak 20%. 6 weeks after the overseas market exploded in the 13th week, the total box office in the overseas market skyrocketed from $400 million to $281 billion. This data also pushed the total global box office of the film to $852 billion. Although the North American box office fell into the millions range, this also meant that the North American box office of Titanic would not be too different from the previous world. However, due to the use of a completely different overseas distribution strategy from the original spacetime, a large number of overseas countries released Titanic one after another in the weeks when it was at its peak. Therefore, it aroused more potential audiences' desire to watch the film, making the overseas box office of Titanic even better than before. Although the continuous decline of the North American box office of Titanic in his previous life would certainly have the same effect, because the distributor Fox lacked confidence in the film's overseas promotion and theatrical scale were doomed to be incomparable to now. When Titanic achieved the double miracle of box office and awards in North America, many overseas countries' release rhythm had come to an end. The awards and box office miracle of Titanic in North America could no longer fully stimulate the market. At the same time, Eric also found that because of the different distribution strategy, most of the overseas market had been completely stimulated, and the recovery cycle of the overseas box office was obviously more concentrated. Due to the popularity of Titanic, once it was released, most overseas audiences who were interested in Titanic would choose to go to the cinema to watch it as soon as it was released. This was the main reason why Titanic miraculously set a record of $236 million overseas box office in the 14th week. Moreover, this factor also caused the overseas box office of Titanic to drop significantly more than in North America. The higher 25% drop in the 15th week relative to North America also caused Titanic to fail to continue to achieve the record of $200 million in a week. However, although the overseas box office of Titanic had fallen to $68 million in the past week, the weekly box office decline in the overseas market had also clearly begun to narrow to within 20%. This meant that after the film squeezed out the ordinary passers-by who were purely affected by the box office awards in a few weeks, the core fanbase overseas was still working hard compared to North America. It was estimated that in the next 2 months, the overseas box office of Titanic could still earn about $300 million. Coupled with the remaining strength of the box office in North America, this also meant that the total global box office of Titanic was likely to reach $2 billion in the end. Thinking back to the end of last year, affected by a large number of negative comments in the media and the lack of confidence of everyone around him, Eric only hoped that the film could recover its cost and everything would be fine. Later, the North American box office of Titanic began to explode. Only then did Eric let go of his anxiety and began to look forward to the film's box office data in his previous life. After the Oscars, the film accumulated popularity for several months and began to be released on a large scale. It also created a miracle of $236 million in the overseas box office in a week. Eric couldn't help but feel that perhaps the global box office of the film could exceed $2 billion. Now, looking at the Firefly Distribution Department's final forecast of $2 billion for the film's final box office, Eric had no other thoughts in his mind. Perhaps a miracle should be something that exceeds the limits of everyone's imagination. In the email page, behind the global box office forecast, there was a detailed analysis of several important overseas box office countries by the distribution department. Eric was no longer interested in this information. He scrolled down the page and intended to quickly skim through the rest of the email. However, when he saw the Japanese box office analysis, Eric was suddenly attracted by a number. 30 billion yen. This was the distribution department's estimate of the total box office of Titanic in Japan. The reason why Eric noticed this number was not only because it was 80 million more than the box office in the original universe. It was also because this number was almost the same as the #1 box office in Japan in the original universe, Spirited Away. However, after the exchange rate conversion, the 30 billion yen was equivalent to $280 million. But he happened to remember that in history, the domestic box office of Spirited Away was $250 million. Where did the other $30 million go? Glancing at the page again, Eric quickly found a set of numbers. 1071. This was the current exchange rate of the yen to the USD. In an instant, Eric understood a lot of things. In the original universe, Titanic was released in North America at the end of 1997. The release time in Southeast Asia was about the same. At the end of 1997, what time was that? The financial crisis was raging throughout Southeast Asia. In Eric's memory, the currencies of Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries were almost cut in half. Even Japan, affected by the overall economic situation, currency depreciation reached about 20%. These devastated currency systems obviously could not return to normal in a short period of time. Then, according to this series of information conversion, in 1998, the exchange rate of the yen to the USD should be about 133:1. At that time, the box office of Titanic in Japan was equivalent to $200 million. According to the current exchange rate of 107:1, it should be about $250 million. The 30 million difference this time should be an additional gain due to factors such as the change in distribution strategy, rather than the incredible 80 million just now. Realizing this, Eric immediately operated the mouse again and slid the page to the detailed overseas box office numbers. In addition to Japan, the main Southeast Asian countries and regions such as Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, the current cumulative box office also reached $120 million. The follow-up piecemeal income was expected to be about $30 million. In other words, Southeast Asian countries and regions, including Japan, would eventually contribute about $430 million to the global box office of Titanic. According to the 35% overseas share, Firefly could earn about $150 million. But obviously, this had to be under the condition that the Southeast Asian currency system remained stable. Based on the progress of most of the Southeast Asian theaters, if Firefly followed the usual settlement steps, they would have to wait until September to get a share of the profits. At that time, the economic crisis in Southeast Asia would be in full swing. Due to exchange rate factors, Firefly's $2 billion global box office figure would definitely be lowered. If this was not important, the most direct result would be that Firefly would eventually lose more than $50 million in revenue due to the currency devaluation in Southeast Asia. Even though Firefly was a big company, Eric could not give up $50 million for nothing. Eric organized his thoughts and opened the draft box to write an email. He described his series of findings in detail and hoped that the management of Firefly could discuss and come up with a corresponding solution as soon as possible. On the other side of the living room, the bathroom door opened. Cindy walked out with only a towel wrapped around her body. She swayed her long white legs and walked out flirtatiously. Cindy sat down in her seat and tidied up her wet hair. When she saw Eric typing on the keyboard, she shook her legs restlessly and reached out her toes to scratch Eric's leg. Eric stopped typing and turned his head to look at the woman. He picked up the glass of whiskey and drank the last bit. He shook the glass at Cindy and said, "Here, hold it." The ice cube in the glass had melted to the size of a walnut. It made a crisp tinkling sound as Eric shook the glass. Cindy took the glass with a smile on her face. However, her eyes were watery as she said, "Again, this ice cube was soaked in whiskey. Do you want me to die from the spiciness?" "I'd love to see you die from the spiciness," Eric said with a smile as he glanced at the glass of whiskey that Cindy hadn't drunk yet. He then began to type on the keyboard again. Cindy looked at the ice cube in her glass and shrunk her neck. She obediently picked up Eric's glass and poured the ice cube into her mouth. Her cheeks were puffed up as she stared at Eric. Eric ignored the woman's attempt to act cute. He finished writing the email and copied it to Katzenberg, Frank Wales, and several other executives. Only then did he turn off his computer. Cindy saw that Eric was done with his work. She blinked and spat out the ice cube in her mouth. She held it in her hand. The ice cube's original edges were a lot smoother. It seems a bit big. Eric picked up the woman and walked to the sofa. He smiled and said, "Don't you always like big ones?" Pfft, oh. When Eric sent the email, some people in Los Angeles were still working. It didn't take long for Katzenberg and the others to call. After spending the weekend in East Hampton, Eric returned to Los Angeles on Monday. The first meeting he attended was to formally discuss Eric's email. According to our preliminary plan, in the conference room, Katzenberg recounted the results of everyone's discussion over the weekend. We can use hedging methods in foreign exchange transactions to cash out the benefits of the Southeast Asian countries in advance. However, this will definitely cause a certain amount of losses. Eric read the document that Katzenberg had drafted over the weekend. He looked up and said, "Now, our summer movies Finding Nemo, Prison in the Sky, Jedi Cop 2, and Jurassic Park 3, and Rush Hour 2, at the end of the year should have discussed distribution agreements with Southeast Asian distributors, right?" Chapter 856. Eric, are you saying that we should use the distribution contracts of these films as bargaining chips in exchange for the Southeast Asian companies to settle the box office of Titanic in advance? As soon as Eric finished his sentence, the president of the distribution department, Robert Thompson, asked knowingly. Eric nodded, but quickly shook his head. "We can do that, but it's not limited to that. What I mean is that we need to prepare for the worst for the Southeast Asian economy. While we try to recover our share of Titanic as soon as possible, we should pre-sell the distribution rights of the film to distributors in Southeast Asia at a buyout price in the future." The phenomenon of pre-selling distribution rights of Hollywood films was very common, especially for those second- and third-tier film companies with limited distribution capabilities. Even in the United States, in order to recoup funds as soon as possible, they often adopted the method of pre-selling distribution rights. However, after years of expansion of distribution channels, due to the strong worldwide film distribution network, Firefly Group rarely used this kind of low-yield pre-sale distribution strategy, even for some of its low to medium-budget films. After all, the logic was just like farming. The same piece of land, primitive slash-and-burn farming and complex intensive farming would definitely yield different crops. Sure enough, as soon as Eric finished his sentence, there was an immediate outcry of objection. Robert Thompson said, "Eric, the box office of Titanic is almost confirmed. If we try to recover our share of the profits in advance, there won't be any losses. However, if we sell the distribution rights of the films that haven't been released yet, not only will it be difficult for us to get a high price, but if the box office of some of the films explodes, the decision we made to avoid the economic crisis that may not happen may bring us even greater losses." The entire Southeast Asian region accounts for 30% of the total overseas box office. I strongly recommend against this. Eric recalled the box office data of Titanic that he saw last Friday night. The entire Southeast Asian region did account for about 30% of the total overseas box office of the film. However, Japan accounted for about 20% of the total overseas box office. In his memory, during the Southeast Asian economic crisis, Japan's currency depreciated by about 20%. It was far lower than other Southeast Asian countries whose currency systems were generally cut in half. Moreover, compared to other Southeast Asian countries, Japan's economic recovery speed was obviously faster. Since that was the case, 20% currency depreciation was still acceptable to Firefly. As for the other Southeast Asian votes, there was no need to insist at all. It was conceivable that when the economic crisis broke out, the small Southeast Asian box office share, which originally only accounted for 10% of the overseas box office share, would definitely fall to an insignificant 5% under the impact of currency depreciation. There was no possibility of recovery in the short term. Perhaps, in the next few years, Hong Kong films, which were already on the decline, would completely fall into silence. This should be related to the sharp contraction of the Southeast Asian market. After thinking for a while, Eric said, "Let's do it this way. For Southeast Asia, Japan will maintain the original distribution strategy. As for Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., we will follow the plan I just mentioned." If the Japanese market was excluded, the remaining small market in Southeast Asia was not even comparable to Latin America. The group of senior executives no longer insisted. After discussing the details of the implementation, they began the next topic. The meeting lasted the entire morning. Eric had lunch at the headquarters in Burbank and hurried back to Shophorn Manor. When he was still in New York, Madonna called several times and wanted to visit Eric after he returned to Los Angeles. At this time, Madonna had begun a lawsuit with Warner Records over the issue of digital distribution rights. Although the outcome was still uncertain, this incident, as a fuse, would obviously attract more musicians' attention to online music sales. Coupled with the close cooperation between the two sides in the Yahoo Music Store, Eric would not hesitate to set aside half a day to meet with Madonna, so he made an appointment for this afternoon. Of course, Eric also knew that Madonna's visit this time might be to urge him to write a song for her. This was what Eric had promised her more than a month ago. Tomorrow was the celebration party for the box office of Titanic, breaking $1.8 billion. Katzenberg also had to rush from the headquarters in Burbank to Playa Vista Studios in the afternoon, so he took the opportunity to hitch a ride with Eric and talk about some official business. When Eric mentioned his intention to return to Shophorn Manor, Katzenberg said, "Speaking of Yahoo Music Store, although Warner Records and Universal Records are not involved in this lawsuit, Barry Weiss from Firefly Records called a few days ago. Warner Records is privately interested in poaching the Backstreet Boys from us." Eric asked, "If I remember correctly, their contract should be 5 years, right?" "Yes, about 2000. Barry said that they were a little tempted, but Warner Records might not be willing to pay them in full for the breach of contract, so they did not reach an agreement. However, if the contract expires," Katzenberg paused and looked at Eric, then said, "I'm afraid they won't stay with Firefly Records anymore." Eric knew that the close cooperation between Firefly Records and Yahoo Music Store would definitely cause some scruples among their artists. Due to the publicity of other record companies, most singers subconsciously felt that the cooperation between Firefly Records and Yahoo Music Store was on the basis of sacrificing their interests. Under the manipulation of several major record companies, the American Music Association was not even willing to admit the sales of digital music albums, which would undoubtedly cause the sales of Firefly Record singers to be much lower than the actual number. Eric did not think so. Due to the impact of the Internet, the decline of the physical record industry was almost inevitable. The cooperation between Firefly Records and Yahoo Music Store to open up the online music sales market in advance could, to a large extent, reduce the damage of online music piracy to Firefly Records artists. At the same time, Firefly Records singers would definitely be able to enjoy more media promotion resources on Yahoo's online platform. Eric believed that with the further promotion of Fireflyer, this advantage would quickly become apparent in the next few years. "Whatever Universal Warner wants to do, we'll deal with it as they come," Eric said as he looked out of the window. At this time, the car was shuttling through Venice Boulevard. Eric happened to see a huge movie poster of Godzilla flash past him. If he did not consider the information in his memory, the upcoming summer was still very important. In addition to Finding Nemo, The Lion King 2, and Ice Age, there were also 3 super live-action blockbusters in this summer. James Bond, Casino Royale, directed by Eric himself, Batman and Robin, produced by Warner Brothers, and Godzilla, produced by Sony Pictures. The production cost of these 3 blockbusters was more than $100 million. The production cost of James Bond, Casino Royale was $110 million, which was the lowest of the 3 films. Batman and Robin cost $120 million, and Godzilla cost $150 million. At the same time, as the only blockbuster focused on CG effects this summer, Sony was very confident in Godzilla, perhaps because of the recent success of Titanic. Although the production cost was $150 million, Sony did not hesitate to invest $70 million into the promotion budget, raising the total cost of Godzilla to $220 million. This monster blockbuster needed to earn $600 million worldwide to recover its cost from the box office. Eric did not remember the global box office of Godzilla in his previous life, but according to the bad reviews that were continuously criticized for more than a decade, it was definitely far less than $600 million. Although the producer of Godzilla was Sony, the special effects were completely handled by the digital domain. It was very easy for Eric to see the source material of this film. This version of Godzilla was similar to the Tyrannosaurus Rex in his previous life. Eric did not think that this film had much of a chance of success. As for Batman and Robin, it was not worth mentioning. However, Warner Brothers and Sony were very confident. Perhaps they noticed that Firefly did not have any blockbusters with special effects released this summer, so they followed Universal's strategy last year and set the release date for Firefly's usual June. Obviously, they had something up their sleeves. This could be seen from the specific release dates of the two blockbusters. Firefly's summer release was still a trilogy strategy. However, it was different from the past. Due to the absence of Jurassic Park 3, Firefly only had 2 films released in June. They were Prison in the Sky, starring Cage, and Pixar's latest animated film, Finding Nemo. The other film was The Forest of Mount Tai, produced by Disney Pictures. However, this medium-budget animated live-action movie was set to be released in mid-July so as not to compete directly with James Bond, Casino Royale, which was released at the end of June. As for the other 2 films, Prison in the Sky was released on May 30th, and Finding Nemo was released on June 13th. Perhaps Sony and Warner Brothers still had some concerns about Prison in the Sky, which was produced by Jerry Bruckheimer and starred by Nicolas Cage. Therefore, they decided to release Godzilla on June 6th, and Batman and Robin on June 20th, which was 1 week before and 1 week after Finding Nemo. Obviously, Sony and Warner Brothers wanted to bully Finding Nemo, while their blockbusters were sweeping the box office. This was the first time Eric saw the detailed schedule for this summer. He almost had the urge to mourn for the 2 companies. 2 blockbusters teasing a box office seed of $1 billion. Who knows who would bully who? In addition to the major studios, New Line Cinema would also release 2 films this summer. They were Jedi Cop 2 on July 4th and Final Destination 2 on July 18th. This also increased the total number of Firefly's summer release to 5 films. In previous years, in order to concentrate as much publicity resources as possible, New Line usually did not participate in the summer release with too much fanfare. However, after last year's explosion, New Line also began to officially show its strength. Obviously, from the schedule of the 2 films, New Line would focus on the summer release in July in the future, achieving a seamless connection with the main studio in June. The fact that Firefly was the dominant company at this time had been completely exposed since Forbes magazine used the word oligarch at the beginning of the year. Thus, Eric didn't mind letting the Fireflies show off even more. At this time, Firefly's film business had already steadily occupied about 30% of the box office every year. However, if this proportion could be increased to 40%, Eric would definitely not hold back. Along the way, Eric chatted with Katzenberg about trivial matters. After sending him to Firefly, they returned to Malibu. It was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned to the Sharp Corner Manor. Madonna had already arrived in advance. She was sitting on the sofa by the glass wall and chatting with Drew. This was specially arranged by Eric. From the bottom of his heart, he did not want to be alone with this bold and unrestrained music queen. When they saw Eric walk in, Madonna and the girl stood up at the same time to greet him. Eric hugged the 2 girls and asked with a smile, "What are you talking about?" The girl intimately held Eric's arm and sat down on the sofa. Her soft little body leaned over and said, "We were just talking about Final Destination 2. Maggie is very curious about who will be killed at the beginning of the movie this time." Final Destination 2" would also be released this summer. Although it was not as big as the blockbusters, it still received a lot of attention. The girl personally played the role of the girl who was killed at the beginning of the first movie. Because of her completely different level of influence from her previous life, this also became a hot topic for many fans. According to the usual practice, MGM would definitely not let go of this publicity stunt. It was very likely that the sequel would also invite other powerful stars to play similar roles. Eric reached out and took the coffee cup from Natasha. He curiously asked, "Oh, I don't know yet. Who is it? Why don't you guess first?" Eric looked at Madonna and shook his head with a smile. "I can't guess. Don't tell me you came back to life in the movie and then got killed again? Haha, how can I be that bored?" The girl coquettishly shook Eric's arm and said, "It's Rachel." Before Eric could react, Madonna was already surprised. "Rachel Weisz?" The girl nodded. The box office of Titanic exploded, and as the male and female leads, Xiao Li and Rachel, could be said to have soared to the sky. Even Julia and Nicole couldn't be compared to Rachel's strong popularity recently. One could imagine how shocking it would be if the fans knew that Rose was suddenly killed in a horror movie. Eric was really curious. He asked the girl, "How did you get her to come here?" Chapter 857. Eric was really curious and asked the girl, "How did you coax her to come over?" Drew giggled and said, "Rachel has always been crazy. She doesn't need me to coax her. Until the beginning of this year, we were still looking for a candidate for the opening role. After the box office of Titanic exploded, I called Rachel. She was very interested, and then it was confirmed." Eric also remembered the interesting things that Carolyn had told him about Rachel Weisz. Such a tough girl who liked to drive a Jaguar King with a large displacement was definitely not as ladylike as she looked. Suddenly thinking of something, Eric said, Rachel agreed. Her agent must be furious, right? Rachel had just become an A-list actress with Titanic, and had not had time to go further, but she suddenly went to make a guest appearance in a horror film. Not to mention the price, this contrast in image could affect her popularity if they did not pay attention. Yes, they were furious. Even Kapoor called me and told me not to act so recklessly. In the end, you still filmed it? Yes, Rachel was also very angry. She said that she did not want to be a puppet at the mercy of her agent, and then she filmed it. Eric smiled and did not care too much. This was just a willful guest appearance, and the crew of Scream 2 would definitely not overturn Rachel's image. Other than a gimmick, the possibility of a substantial negative impact was not too high. After chatting about a few interesting things, Eric turned to Madonna, who was sitting next to him. After all, she was a guest, and he could not be too cold. "Maggie, what about you? What have you been doing recently?" Madonna leaned lazily on the single-seater sofa, holding a coffee cup and listening to the conversation between Eric and Drew with interest. She replied, "Me? I'm very free. So, Eric, do you think Firefly has a suitable movie for me?" Madonna was definitely one of the singers in the circle who liked to go to Hollywood the most. Not only did she appear and disappear mysteriously in all kinds of bad movies that couldn't even enter the cinema, but she also often teased Hollywood filmmakers. Last year's Mrs. Varon could be said to be Madonna's most famous movie. At that time, this project almost fell into the hands of Firefly. However, considering the quality of Madonna's previous works, the production department rejected the $55 million budget of the main creative team. In the end, they did not reach an agreement. Later on, this decision was proven to be correct. Although Mrs. Varon won the Golden Globe Awards and the Oscars, its North American box office only grossed a little more than $50 million. Warner Brothers, who took over the project, still suffered a small loss. Eric recalled the string of sour plums on Madonna's body and immediately shook his head in fear. "I think it's better for you to focus on singing. Eric, your words are really hurtful." Madonna glanced sideways at Eric. She didn't sound angry. Although she seemed arrogant and even narcissistic in the eyes of outsiders, she was definitely not the kind of person who didn't know her place. After chatting for a while, Madonna brought up the matter of writing a song. Eric got up and said, "Actually, I already wrote it when I was in New York. Come with me." Madonna immediately stood up with a look of excitement, but the girl did not follow. She waved her hand at Eric and lazily lay on the sofa. She picked up the remote control and turned on the wall-mounted TV not far away. Eric took Madonna to the door of the study on the lower floor. He hesitated for a moment and remembered that there was nothing on the writing board that needed to be kept secret. He opened the door. Madonna followed Eric down the stairs to the study. Like many visitors who came in for the first time, she was surprised by the huge writing board that occupied the entire wall. At this time, many Iron Man armor drawings were attached to the writing board with magnets, and there were some notes handwritten by Eric next to them. Madonna couldn't help but walk to the writing board and browse the Iron Man drawings that had been colored and rendered with a metallic texture. She exclaimed, "These are all Iron Man. It's so cool. The comic image of Iron Man is actually very rough. Therefore, even people who often read comics will inevitably feel amazed when they see these realistic drawings at this time." Eric walked to Madonna and looked at the drawings attached to the writing board. He nodded and said, "Yes, when the movie is made, the effect will be even cooler. I'm really looking forward to seeing these in the movie. Eric, will you be the director this time?" "No, but I will be in charge of the production." Madonna browsed through the dozen or so drawings with great interest and asked a few questions curiously before she went to the piano in the corner with Eric. Eric sat down in the chair and handed over the written music score and lyrics. "Here, take a look first." Madonna didn't sit down next to him. She took the folder handed over by Eric and leaned against the piano and couldn't wait to open it. "Alive, looking at the name, it has a bit of a rock and roll flavor," Madonna commented subconsciously after just glancing at the name of the song. "This is originally an electronic rock song." Eric also listened to the song "Ray of Light" that Madonna sent over, which also has a strong rock and roll style. Only then did he remember this song, so after slightly modifying it, he took it out. In the future, after the post-arrangement, the style of the whole song will definitely be more suitable for Madonna's new album, but this is not something that Eric needs to worry about. What Madonna doesn't lack is a professional team. Nodding, Eric replied, "Yes, combined with the song Radiance, that you are going to use as the main song, it is When We Are Alive, Radiance." Madonna immediately took it, and there was a little more excitement in her expression. She said, "This is really ambitious, but I like it." However, after watching the whole song and humming it, Madonna looked up at Eric straightforwardly and said, "Eric, although this song is great, it doesn't seem to be as amazing as your previous songs." Eric didn't mind Madonna's straightforwardness. He spread out his hands and explained, "Maggie, this is the limitation of the style of your album itself. I can't make a round biscuit with a square mold." The album that Madonna was creating was completely different from the style of her previous pop music. It was full of strong electronic music elements and combined classical, rock, bass, and other styles. To put it bluntly, it was actually an experimental mix album. When Eric listened to the sample song sent by Madonna, he really didn't feel much, and it was impossible to search for a similar style of stunning works from his memory. To be honest, Eric felt that the whole album was quite mediocre. However, he happened to remember that the album Radiance was once rated as one of the best albums in Madonna's personal music career in the original Spacetime. This may be the reason why a top Cantonese chef suddenly made a table of Sichuan dishes inevitably gave people a sense of novelty. Whether it was an actor or a singer, after a long period of being the same, suddenly changing their style would often get good reviews. Due to the sudden change of her previous style, Madonna actually didn't have any expectations for this album, but her original road had reached a dead end, so she had to change. Listening to Eric, Madonna also thought that he was also not very optimistic about this album. However, Madonna still asked with a trace of expectation, "Eric, what do you think of this album?" Eric smiled and said, "You want to hear the truth?" Madonna rolled her eyes at him and said, "Forget it, you can just tell me some lies to make me happy." "Well, no kidding," Eric said seriously. "Although your album is not in line with my personal taste at all, the possibility of success is still very high. This may even become another peak in your music career." Madonna raised her eyebrows excitedly and expectantly. "Are you serious?" "Of course," Eric nodded. "First of all, the popularity you have accumulated over the years is still very strong, which is the biggest foundation for the success of this album. Secondly, people are always full of novelty to change, and this album happens to cater to this public preference. Finally, with the song I gave you, I think you will definitely not let go of such a publicity stunt, right? So, I bet that this album can sell at least 15 million copies worldwide. As for whether it can hit 20 million, it depends on your luck. 15 million copies, 20 million copies, speaking of which, these were very far away for Madonna. Her last album that sold more than 10 million copies worldwide was 7 years ago, and in recent years, her album sales were only a few million. Although such sales figures were still unattainable for second- and third-tier singers, for her, it could only be described as a failure. If those words were said by someone else, Madonna might just be happy and take it as a compliment. But when it was said by Eric, she almost immediately believed it, so her whole person was a little excited. As an ambitious woman, she was never willing to be silent. In her excitement, Madonna's nature was revealed. She came over and put her hands on Eric's shoulders and began to seduce him. "Then, Eric, since it's a bet, what do you want to bet?" Eric moved back a little on the swivel chair to avoid Madonna's body that wanted to straddle his lap. He shook his head and said, "Stop, Maggie, I don't want to bet on anything." "Then I'll just admit defeat," Madonna said, moving closer. Her hands slid from Eric's shoulders to his chest, as if she wanted to unbutton his shirt. Eric saw that words could not subdue the vixen, so he reached out and grabbed her two wrists, and his body moved back a little. Madonna's hands were restrained by Eric, and her body lost support and suddenly fell in front of Eric. Releasing Madonna's hands, Eric pressed the woman who struggled to get up, pinched her well-maintained face, and said in a very cold tone, "In that case, use your mouth, I can reluctantly accept." Madonna looked up and saw Eric's condescending gaze, and felt the strength of the big hands on her cheeks. The humiliation in the other party's words not only did not make her angry, but she felt weak all over, and almost trembled as she whispered, "Oh, Eric Williams, you are really a bastard." After more than a month of busy work, the model of the Titanic that was originally in Rosarito, Mexico, had been completely transported back and built in Firefly Cineplex. Because Cameron spent a lot of money to almost completely duplicate a large number of furniture, carpets, curtains, and even tableware inside the Titanic, the rearrangement was also very fast. At this time, the first-class banquet hall in the model of the Titanic had been refurbished. The celebration banquet for the global box office of Titanic, breaking $1.8 billion was held in the banquet hall of the ship. It was already evening, and the guests attending the celebration party were arriving one after another. Eric, Cameron, and Katzenberg stood side by side on the observation deck outside the ship's steering room, which was the position that the captain of the Titanic used to occupy in the movie. The ship just happened to be oriented east-west, facing Mariandre Bay not far away, occupying a large area in the northeast corner of the Cineplex. This was naturally the result of Cameron's insistence, otherwise the hull would have to conform to the rectangular layout of the Cineplex that was slanted in the northeast direction. However, it was also because of this insistence that at this time, when the sky was covered with burning clouds, the view from the railing was exceptionally magnificent. The 3-meter-high walls of the Cineplex and the low buildings in the outer area could not block the view on the deck at all. At a glance, they could see the densely packed yachts in Mariandre Bay and the sparkling sea level further away. "Eric, see, I said it would be best to build the view like this." Cameron was very high-spirited, holding the railing and looking down at the guests who imitated Jack and Rose's classic pose on the bow deck below, and continued, "I also plan to build an exhibition area for the boiler room inside, and it would be best if we could replicate the huge transmission shaft. It would only cost another $2 million. You know, we still have the original props. However, Jeffrey hopes that the interior of the cabin can be converted into a warehouse." "Oh, can you imagine, the Titanic has become a warehouse?" Eric smiled and looked at the helpless Katzenberg, and said, "Jeffrey also hopes that this model can be used as much as possible." "Jim, you have to know, if it is completely useless, maybe, in a few years, we will have to dismantle this model. After all, it occupies a large area. Cameron saw that Eric was not on his side this time, so he retorted, "Are the restaurants, banquet halls, and souvenir shops not enough?" "Of course these are enough, but forget about the boiler room, Jim. People won't be interested in these." Cameron was still unwilling to give up and said, "Before this movie was released, many people also thought that people would not be interested in such a movie." The two sides bargained for a while, and Eric finally agreed that Cameron could build a small exhibition hall, but most of the bottom area would still be used as a storage warehouse in the Cineplex. After all, the huge hull of more than 270 meters covered an area almost equivalent to 4 large studios in the Cineplex. If it was not used, it would be very likely to be dismantled in the future, as Eric said. Chapter 858. With the passage of time, the sky had darkened. The giant Titanic model, which was located in the northeast corner of Firefly Cineplex, had also lit up all the lights. Against the surrounding twilight, it really looked like a huge ship drifting on the sea. As the most high-profile party in Los Angeles after the Vanity Fair dinner in March, the celebration banquet for the global box office of Titanic, breaking $1.8 billion had gathered more than 700 Hollywood stars, singers, and celebrities. Because most of the most powerful people in Hollywood were gathered at this party, many people spared no effort to get an invitation to this party. Eric even saw the girl receive a call last night asking for an invitation through her connections. At 7 o'clock, the party officially began. Because everyone was not the kind of person who liked to procrastinate, there was no lengthy speech. Katzenberg and Cameron each gave a simple speech and officially announced the news of the Titanic theme exhibition to the invited media. The party officially began. Although most of the areas of the Titanic model had not yet been opened, due to its inherent large size, more than 700 guests and a large number of service staff were scattered in the banquet hall, dining room, bow, and top deck. It did not seem crowded at all. Eric and Drew exchanged greetings with a group of more important guests, then went to the restaurant to eat something. In order to prepare for this party, Eric had been busy all afternoon, and now his stomach was rumbling with hunger. After taking 2 servings of food from the buffet table, Eric and the girl had just found an empty table when Elizabeth and Julia walked in through the door. The two women did not avoid the strange looks of other people in the dining room. They took the food and walked straight over. "Good evening, Eric." Elizabeth sat down on the seat on Eric's left under Julia's slightly resentful gaze. She nodded to him and looked at the girl. "Good evening, little B***TCH. Seeing that the girl picked up the fork and was about to play darts, Eric quickly stopped her. "Okay, stop it. Liz, apologize to Drew. Don't talk like that in the future." Elizabeth was very reluctant. She pursed her lips and said, "I'm sorry, little Drew." "Humph." The girl shook the cutlery in her hand and said, "If there weren't so many people here, I would definitely ask Natasha to beat you up." Elizabeth was not afraid at all. She raised her small chin and said, "If you have the ability, do it yourself. I'm afraid that I'll disfigure you. Heh, you're not that pretty to begin with. What if? Skitiske, that would be too tragic." Eric was helpless against the two women's habitual bickering. He could only threaten them. "If you two continue to bicker, I'll go somewhere else with Julia." Before Elizabeth and Drew could respond, Julia immediately looked at Eric expectantly and nodded like a chick pecking at rice. "Yes, yes, yes." Elizabeth was very dissatisfied with Julia's reaction. "What are you talking about? You really have no position. Liz, if you dare to yell at me again, I won't film for Fox anymore." The girl immediately took advantage of the situation. "Yes, Julia, come to MGM. I'll give you 20 million yuan as a salary." Elizabeth teased. 20 million yuan. "If you have the ability, bring me the contract now. I'll sign it for Julia." Eric interrupted the two kittens scratching each other in time and picked a slightly more serious topic. He said, "Speaking of which, how much did you pay Julia for this film?" Because of the half-real and half-fake relationship between the two women, Julia had basically been filming for Fox for the past few years. After last year's Shakespeare's Love, Julia quickly collaborated with Fox on a romance film. Eric also had a little hand in it, so he easily picked My Best Friend's Wedding, which Julia had a good reputation for. However, after bringing Claudia Schiffer into the cast, Eric didn't care about this anymore. Recently, he only saw that My Best Friend's Wedding was scheduled to be released in mid-July. Together with Ice Age, they were Fox's summer movies. Julia 15 million yuan, Claudia 5 million yuan. Elizabeth didn't hide it and said, the total cost was only $40 million, and they took up half of it. The salaries of actors are really getting higher and higher now. I feel that it will be difficult for low-budget commercial films to hire A-level stars in the future, especially after Titanic. Everyone will definitely focus on a few blockbusters every year. A-level actors will also definitely lean towards these movies. Perhaps, only these movies can afford A-level stars. Oh, it's only in the past few years. I heard that Germany has begun to discuss the topic of revising the tax laws to prevent capital outflows. Since Jim Carrey received the first $20 million from Sony Pictures, most A-level stars in the past few years had greatly increased their net worth. However, Eric also knew that this phenomenon was mainly caused by a large number of tax-avoiding funds from all over the world flowing into Hollywood, especially from Germany. In recent years, the funds flowing into Hollywood had exceeded $3 billion per year, accounting for almost a quarter of all the film production budgets in Hollywood. However, the good days of Hollywood superstars were actually in the last few years. In the next few years, when the new technology bubble burst, some important film capital exporters would tighten their investments, and the salaries of Hollywood superstars would return to rationality. Even if they were still worth $20 million, there were not many who could really get $20 million. Eric was casually chatting with the three women when Cameron hurried over from the restaurant door. He nodded to the three women and said to Eric, "Eric, come with me, I'll take you to see someone." Eric got up and asked curiously, "Who?" Cameron smiled and said mysteriously, "Peter Parker." Eric immediately understood. Cameron had recently begun to look for the male lead for Spider-Man. Eric did not have any feelings for the previous Spider-Man actors, so he did not intervene in this matter and let Cameron do what he wanted. He just gestured to the three women, and Eric left with Cameron, feeling assured. In fact, without him, why Elizabeth and Drew could be more harmonious. The two women were very smart and would not really have any conflicts in public. Cameron was mysterious all the way, and Eric was too lazy to immediately get to the bottom of it. The two came to the top deck together, and following Cameron's guidance, Eric immediately saw a family of 4 standing together. A couple, a boy of 16 or 17 years old, and a girl of 5 or 6 years old. Eric recognized them at first glance. He took 2 steps forward and patted the young man's shoulder. Then, he pulled the young man over and hugged him. "Hey Stu, long time no see." He sighed emotionally. "Hey Stu, long time no see." The family in front of him was Eric's neighbor when he lived in North Hollywood, Runkle's family. The boy who Eric hugged was naturally the male lead of Home Alone, Stuart Runkle. After filming Home Alone 3, due to his age, Stuart Runkle was no longer suitable to continue the path of child stars, and he had been silent for years. Eric later vaguely heard that his family moved to New York, and he never saw them again. In fact, what Eric was more fortunate was that Stuart Runkle did not follow the path of Macaulay Culkin in the Uehara spacetime. "Eric, I'm so happy to see you again." Stuart Runkle was obviously a little excited. After the hug, the boy immediately turned around, pulled the little girl of 5 or 6 years old over, and introduced, "Eric, this is my sister Linda." "Hello, little one." Eric reached out his hand. The little girl was obviously carefully taught. She obediently reached out and shook Eric's hand, and said in a childish tone, "Hello, Mr. Williams, I like your movies very much." Eric smiled and joked, "Did you see your brother in the movie?" The little girl nodded, "I saw him, my brother was so good at that time, I also want to be like him." "Oh, then your parents will have a headache," Eric joked, and then greeted the Runkle couple. Although there were some disagreements in the later cooperation, it was the past at this time, and Eric certainly did not care about it. The attitude of the Runkle couple was much more humble and sophisticated than a pair of children, and they carefully complimented each other, and they did not forget to mention some old things in the past. After chatting for a few minutes, Eric was not in a hurry to ask Cameron what was going on. After all, everything was clear. In the original plan, Eric hoped that the new version of Spider-Man would start when Peter Parker was in high school. Although most of the high school students in Hollywood teen movies were basically played by actors over 20 years old, this was also a helpless move to maintain the quality of the actors. After all, the young actors who were really in high school would definitely not be good enough. If there was an actor whose age completely matched the acting skills and met the requirements, the film company would definitely not refuse. At this time, in the face of the upcoming Spider-Man movie, Stuart Runkle, who had risen to fame with Home Alone, and was now a 16-year-old boy, was the most suitable candidate. Eric just did not expect Cameron to bring him to him without greeting him at all. Cameron led Eric here and was quickly pulled away by other guests. Eric chatted with the family for a while, then took Stuart to the railing not far away. Casually leaning on the railing, Eric looked at the teenager who was a little reserved in front of him and smiled. "How have you been these years?" "It's okay, mainly going to school, and occasionally taking on 1 or 2 movies." Stuart also leaned on the railing and said, "My parents are quite disappointed, not as glorious as before." "I think it's good. When director Cameron called, I even hesitated whether to go back to my old life." Perhaps it was because of his early experience, Stuart's tone was a bit more mature than a teenager's. Eric nodded slightly and said, "In the end, you decided to give it a try?" "Well, you know my parents," Stuart said. "But, Eric, if I can pass the audition, I hope to sign the contract in 2 months." Eric wondered, in a few months, why? Stuart said frankly, "My 16th birthday in July." Eric also understood. According to federal law, teenagers over the age of 16 could already have financial autonomy. Stuart obviously didn't want his parents to rely on their guardianship to cause any more trouble. "That's not a problem. It's only 2 months. I'll help you delay it." Stuart smiled and said, "Eric, I haven't even auditioned yet." "Oh, I still have a lot of confidence in you." Eric also smiled and said, "But, in fact, this role is not as good as outsiders think. Jim must have told you some of the requirements of this role, right?" "This, he hasn't told me yet. It's like this." Since Cameron did not have time to say it, Eric explained, "We plan to create a very large comic book movie series. So, once this role is confirmed, you have to sign at least 6 contracts at once." Stuart obviously had the intelligence of the past. Although Firefly had not publicly announced the Marvel Cinematic Universe plan, he could guess and said, "Is it like MGM's Secret Service movie universe?" Eric nodded. "Yes, so, if you're sure to participate, you may be tied to this role for at least the next 10 years. Stuart's expression showed some hesitation. Even a slightly idealistic actor would not want to be tied to a role for a long time. Eric would not force anything. In order to ensure the smooth implementation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it was necessary to sign a package contract in advance. This would not change for anyone. Eric did not want to have to go through all kinds of tug-of-war with actors for every movie in the future. After a while, Stuart asked again, "Eric, isn't 6 movies too much? There are basically no Hollywood movies that can make 6 movies, right? Our rough plan is to make 3 solo movies and 3 crossover movies, just like MGM's Secret Service movie universe. So, if we extend it to the later stages, 6 movies may not even be enough." Eric explained briefly. These details would be mentioned before signing the contract with the actors, so it was not considered a secret. After a pause, Eric added with a smile, "However, there's one more thing. Our remuneration plan is also very generous. This will use a floating mechanism linked to the box office. On the basis of a guaranteed salary, the higher the box office, the higher the salary of the lead actor. Moreover, in order to show fairness and equality, if the contract cannot be executed due to Firefly, the actor will also receive a certain amount of compensation." Chapter 859. In the original space-time, Marvel had always been criticized for its actors' pay. This was mainly because Marvel had a very stingy CEO, Isaac Perlmutter. There was even a joke in the industry that the furniture in Marvel Entertainment's office was second-hand goods and so on. Before taking over Marvel from Ron Perlman, Isaac Perlmutter was also a member of the Marvel Board of Directors. When Firefly completely swallowed Marvel, the original board of directors was naturally dissolved. Eric did not extend an olive branch to Isaac Perlmutter. As a boss, Eric certainly hoped that the senior managers could try their best to increase revenue and reduce expenditure to create more profits for the company, but he also felt that there was no need to be so harsh. It would only be counterproductive. Compared to these details, Eric was more concerned about the overall cost control in the production process of Marvel movies, which was the foundation for the stable continuation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Therefore, during the 2 weeks in New York, the discussion of the salary plan of the Marvel movie protagonist occupied most of everyone's time. The core of the final plan was actually 2 points: long-term contracts and the link between salary and box office. In the preliminary plan, the core actors participating in Marvel superhero movies must sign a contract for at least 6 movies. As long as the box office was good enough, Marvel could guarantee that they would get the salary of an A-level star, but they would never pay the sky-high price of $50 million per movie. Casually chatting with Stuart Runkle about these things, the two inevitably talked about some of the past, and they both felt a little emotional. The expectant eyes of the surrounding guests made Stuart realize that Eric was not as free as he appeared to be. After chatting for more than 10 minutes, he said that he would carefully consider whether to participate in Spider-Man. The teenager took the initiative to say goodbye to Eric and walked towards his parents and sister who were waiting not far away. Eric still leaned on the railing and gestured to the waiter passing by. Just as he took a glass of champagne from the waiter's tray, a couple came over. The man had gray hair, wore a well-ironed suit, and wore glasses. He had the air of a university professor, but if anyone knew that he had filmed The Exorcist, which was once known as Hollywood's first horror movie, they would definitely not have such an impression. This man was the Hollywood horror movie master, William Friedkin. The middle-aged woman holding his arm was naturally his wife, the current CEO of Paramount, Shirley Lansing. Eric also noticed that Shirley Lansing's expression clearly carried a hint of accusation. Obviously, the other party's purpose for appearing at tonight's party wasn't that simple. Moreover, according to common sense, although Firefly wouldn't reject such an occasion, it was impossible for her to take the initiative to send an invitation to the head of her competitor, Paramount. Obviously, the other party had come uninvited. Pretending not to notice Shirley Lansing's expression, Eric stood up straight and greeted William Friedkin warmly. "Hi, William, good evening." "Good evening, Eric, this is really a moment worth celebrating." William Friedkin didn't seem to be affected by his wife's emotions, or maybe he didn't show it. He greeted Eric with the same enthusiasm and said, "The global box office is $1.8 billion. This is really a miracle. However, Eric, I'm curious why you chose this number to hold the celebration party. Isn't it better to have $2 billion worldwide?" Eric casually found an excuse and said, "Some things are just done when you think about it. It's not good to always be bound by the inertia of thinking." William Friedkin laughed in agreement. Shirley Lansing continued Eric's words, "But, Eric, don't you think that Firefly went a little overboard in some things?" William Friedkin didn't expect his wife to be so direct. He was a little embarrassed and coughed a few times helplessly. From Shirley Lansing's words, Eric was almost 100% sure of the other party's intentions. Presumably, because of Firefly and Fox's joint strategy to ban The Lion King 2, Paramount was desperate. Although Lei Sherdong once said in the media that The Lion King 2 would kill Finding Nemo and Ice Age, since the end of March, The Lion King 2 had almost completely disappeared from the media networks of Firefly and News Corporation. Yahoo portals and print media related to the Firefly Group and News Corporation also rarely appeared any news related to The Lion King 2. Due to factors such as advertising audiences, the marketing of animated films relied much more on TV advertisements than live-action films. Not only did The Lion King 2 lose more than half of its TV advertising channels in North America, but it was also jointly attacked by Firefly and Fox in terms of advertising on NBC and CBS. Almost all of the marketing activities in the past month could only be described as twice the effort with half the result. On the contrary, the promotion of Finding Nemo and Ice Age was in full swing. With a strong combination of TV, newspapers, the internet, and traditional posters and other marketing methods, the influence of these two animated films spread rapidly among the public like a virus. Since Eric guessed the intention of Shirley Lansing's words, he didn't pretend to be stupid. He shrugged and said, "Shirley, I don't think Firefly went overboard. If I remember correctly, at the end of last year, MTV also rejected the trailer of Titanic." "This is different, Eric," Shirley Lansing argued. "Firefly is completely trying to kill us now. This is not good for either of us." Don't forget, Firefly still retains the rights to the merchandise of The Lion King 2. If The Lion King 2 fails at the box office, you won't get any benefits either. Eric spread his hands and said, "Shirley, it doesn't make any sense for you to say this. Although the 7 major Hollywood companies have never lacked cooperation and occasionally work together on some things, in essence, we will always be competitors. In this case, we will definitely choose the most beneficial plan for ourselves. But the TV network should be an open public service. Eric, what you're doing is illegal. This is unfair competition." "You're wrong, Shirley. The 4 major TV networks have always been private. ABC is mine, Fox is Murdoch's, CBS is Larry Tish's, and NBC is General Electric's. I saw the live broadcast of Jack Welch's speech on NBC last week. It seemed to be an hour long. Do you think that if NBC didn't belong to General Electric, Jack Welch would be able to get a full hour of personal showtime? So, some high-sounding words should be taken for granted. If you take them seriously, you'd be too stupid." Shirley Lansing's fingers clenched the wine glass in her hand tightly. For a moment, she couldn't think of a rebuttal. William Friedkin, who was standing at the side, saw that his wife, who had always been eloquent, was speechless. He took the initiative to smooth things over and said, "Eric, Shirley, there's no need for us to be so stiff, right? Why don't we find a seat and talk slowly? There will be a solution to everything." "William, there's no need for that. I'm glad you could come tonight. Have fun." Eric raised his glass to William Friedkin and turned to leave. If Hollywood could still maintain the stable structure of the 7 major companies coexisting as it did many years ago, Eric would naturally take the initiative to promote a state of coexistence between competition and cooperation. But now, with the rise of Firefly, this coexistence had been completely broken. Eric didn't think there was a need for reconciliation now. After all, reconciliation definitely meant compromise. Eric really couldn't think of any reason for Firefly to compromise at the moment. With the rapid development and growth of Firefly, the film companies and even media groups that were not part of Firefly's system would definitely be strongly impacted and even face a threat to their survival. When that time came, the competition between the parties would even reach the point of life and death. In this level of business competition, it was very unrealistic to seek reconciliation or even sympathy from the opponent, and it was also unwise to take the initiative to give opportunities to the competitor. Perhaps the negotiation was fruitless. After the celebration party of Titanic, just in May, Paramount took the initiative to stir up the topic of The Lion King 2 being jointly banned by Firefly and Fox during the promotion process. Lei Shedong personally logged on to NBC's morning news interview program and angrily accused Firefly and Fox of unfair competition. He even vowed to file a lawsuit with the UA Department of Justice. Perhaps sensing the impending media war, a large number of newspapers in the United States immediately began to follow up, reporting the matter and looking forward to Firefly and Fox's response. However, no matter how Viacom provoked and how angry Lei Shedong was, the senior executives of Firefly and Fox did not respond to this topic. There were no reports on the topic of The Lion King 2 being banned in the media controlled by the two companies. It seemed that in the hearts of Firefly and Fox, this matter did not exist at all. In the end, after being chased by a large number of media reporters for more than a week, Katzenberg finally couldn't take it anymore and spoke up, but he only threw out one sentence. "You can't force McDonald's to advertise for KFC." This sentence was simply too powerful. Everyone knew that as two world-class fast food chains, McDonald's and KFC had always been competitors. Similarly, Firefly Group and Viacom Group were also undisputed competitors. Refusing to advertise for competitors on one's own media platform. Wasn't this a matter of course? Many media outlets, who were filled with righteous indignation and wanted to seek justice for Paramount, calmed down after hearing Katzenberg's words. Some newspapers felt that Firefly Group was too heartless. After all, The Lion King was an animation brand owned by Disney, which was owned by Firefly Group. However, the initial hubbub quickly cooled down when its competitors did not respond to it at all. Even though Viacom was still very reluctant to fan the flames everywhere, it was difficult to incite the media to follow up. Of course, this naturally allowed The Lion King 2 to show its face in front of the public. However, as the main audience of The Lion King 2, no one thought that children between the ages of 6 and 12 would pay attention to this kind of thing. As for the audience of teenagers or adults, they had too many movies to look forward to this summer. Godzilla, Batman and Robin, Casino Royale, Scream 2, Jedi 2, and so on. Even if it was an animated film, even if there was no difference in publicity, after being influenced by several 3D animations from Pixar, it was obviously easier for them to accept Finding Nemo and Ice Age than the traditional 2D hand-drawn animation like The Lion King 2. After the celebration party, from April 25th to May 15th, Titanic earned a total of $163 million in the global box office. On May 16th, Firefly officially announced that the global box office of Titanic exceeded $2 billion, and the total box office figure reached $2.15 billion. This time, Firefly didn't hold a celebration party. Instead, they held interactions with fans in the main box office countries around the world. Although these activities couldn't stimulate the box office potential of Titanic, they directly promoted the sales of a large number of Titanic-related products. Since the release of Titanic, the cumulative sales of Titanic-related products had also exceeded the astonishing figure of $600 million, and with the gradual release of related products in the overseas market, this number would also increase rapidly. Firefly's Related Products Operation Department estimated that the related products of Titanic alone would bring no less than $1.5 billion in sales for Firefly in the next few years. This figure was almost half of Firefly's sales of related products last year. In 1996, Firefly's revenue of related products was only $3.3 billion. This series of huge success figures further stimulated almost all the film companies in Hollywood to frantically search for the next project comparable to Titanic. Even for Firefly itself, Eric had received 4 or 5 blockbuster scripts in a row after returning to Los Angeles a few weeks ago. Obviously, the success of Titanic brought an illusion to the entire Hollywood, making many people think that since the first movie with a global box office of $2 billion appeared, there would be a second, a third, or even more soon. Of course, Eric wouldn't let this success go to his head. Instead, he continued to put most of his energy into the formation of Marvel Pictures and the early preparations for projects such as Spider-Man and Iron Man. Chapter 860. Since everything had just started, Marvel Entertainment in New York would not make any adjustments. For the time being, Marvel Pictures would only set up a simple office in Firefly Studios to be responsible for the logistics and administrative work of the 2 comic book adaptations, Spider-Man and Iron Man, that had already begun. Although the 2 films would not start shooting until at least next year, the early special effects research and development work had already started. The production goals of CG special effects were simply people, scenery, and objects. In the past few years, the focus of technological research and development in the digital field was mostly involved in the 2 aspects of scenery and object. Moreover, it was more focused on object. Special effects shots such as dinosaurs, behemoths, aliens, and spaceships all belong to this category. Images such as hurricanes, floods, and digitized buildings could be classified as scenery. But this time, whether it was Spider-Man or Iron Man, or The Incredible Hulk, Thor, and other movies in the future, there would be a lot of human-related special effects. First of all, this would definitely involve motion capture technology that was very common in the future. Most of the scenes where Tony Stark wore the Iron Man suit in the movie were actually done in a motion capture suit. Motion capture technology had appeared as early as the 1970s, but in history, this technology really received attention and began to be used on a large scale after the success of Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. According to MGM's plan, the Lord of the Rings series would also be launched in the second half of this year, and motion capture would definitely be used by then. Therefore, Eric deliberately made this technology the focus of the digital field in the future and personally followed up on it. As long as they could accumulate enough technology and experience in motion capture in advance, there was no doubt that in the next few years, even if other special effects companies completed the follow-up on traditional CG special effects, the digital field would still maintain a strong leading position in the entire industry. In addition to motion capture technology, fully digitized large-scale city scenes and mechanical transformation special effects with real texture were also included in the technology research and development catalog in the digital field. It was conceivable that once these two special effects technologies were perfectly implemented, not only could they be applied to Marvel films such as Spider-Man and Iron Man, but Firefly could even start the production of Transformers in advance if the hardware rendering conditions permitted. After their encounter at the celebration banquet of Titanic, Cameron specially arranged several detailed additions for Stuart Runkle, and the results were very satisfactory. Stuart had outstanding acting talent, and with his years of experience, it was more than enough for him to handle the image of a talkative Peter Parker. However, the process of signing the contract was destined not to be so smooth. Stuart's management contract was still with CAA. His agent directly rejected Firefly's 6-film package contract, stating that he was only willing to sign 3 films at most, and that he would have to renegotiate the remuneration for each film. This was obviously something that Firefly would not agree to, so the two sides were temporarily in a deadlock. Eric told Stuart in detail at the party about the signing strategy of Marvel's superfilm. He knew that if Stuart was unwilling, he would definitely not participate in Cameron's audition. Perhaps the current situation was as he said at the time. He wanted to wait until his 16th birthday before doing anything else. According to Cameron's temperament, the start of Spider-Man might even be delayed until after Iron Man. Therefore, Eric was not in a hurry to personally intervene in this matter, and let the head of Marvel Pictures and Stuart's agent take their time. On the other hand, Eric himself had also begun to build the framework of the main cast of Iron Man. The director of the original Iron Man, John Farrow, was only playing small roles in various independent films. Although it was a pity, Eric could not directly appoint a newcomer who had never touched a guide as the director of Iron Man. However, the replacement was also very easy to choose. It was Joss Whedon. In the original spacetime, The Avengers, directed by Joss Whedon, had the halo of Marvel superheroes, but the quality of the film itself was also very good. Over the years, Joss Whedon was not only still in charge of the production, director, and screenwriter of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but he had also directed 2 low-budget independent films. In addition, Joss Whedon himself was a super comic book fan, so his ability to handle Iron Man was enough. In addition to the director, the most important person was undoubtedly the male lead. In this regard, Robert Downey Jr. was definitely a hurdle that could not be bypassed. After all, in the original Iron Man, Downey's performance was so successful that it could be said that he was the most perfect character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although the age of the male lead in the new version of Iron Man was adjusted, Downey still met this condition. However, when Eric asked his assistant to contact the other party, he got the news that he had just been put in prison for the second time this year and had been scheduled to go to a drug rehabilitation center after 6 weeks of prison time. According to the information collected by the assistant, Downey's whole person was completely fat due to long-term addiction to drugs, and he did not have the sense of vicissitudes of life that he had when he played Tony Stark. Although it was a little sad, Eric could not wait for the other party to be enlightened again. Instead, he asked people to start looking for new candidates for the role. After all, what Hollywood lacked the most was opportunities, and what it did not lack the least was actors. It happened to be the weekend, and the time was already May 17th. Chris's wedding would be held in 3 days. Eric planned to fly to Maryland today, but he received a call from Avi Allard, CEO of Marvel Entertainment, who wanted to visit, so he had to postpone the trip for a day. The purpose of Avi Allard's visit was also for the casting of the male lead in Iron Man. At the same time, there was another person who came with him that Eric did not expect: Paula Wagner, the producer of Tom Cruise. This was obviously the reason why Avi Allard flew from New York in person. In the reception area next to the glass wall of the Pointy Corner Manor, Avi Allard and Paula Wagner looked at the two girls in tennis uniforms who served them coffee. They could not help but glance at the petite Christina a few more times, but they were tactful enough not to express any opinions. They only politely thanked Miranda Kerr after she poured them coffee. Compared to Miranda, who was already 1.7 meters tall, Christina, who was only 1.5 meters tall and obviously would not grow any taller, was obviously easy to be mistaken as an underage girl. But God knows, Christina was 3 years older than Miranda. A certain innocent face was already a little charming, which really made Eric feel a little helpless. She grew up so fast, so fast, so fast. He did not feel the slightest sense of accomplishment from raising a lowly. Seeing Miranda bending her slender waist and pretending to pour himself a cup of coffee, Eric hurriedly said, "Go play basketball, I don't need your help here." On the other side, Christina put down the coffee pot and asked, "Eric, will the guests stay for lunch?" "Of course, ask the chef to prepare it carefully," Eric said and looked at Avi Allard and Paula Wagner. "Paula, do you have anything in particular that you like?" Paula Wagner shook her head and said, "Anything is fine." Avi Allard echoed, "Me too." "That's all then." Eric waved his hand again. "You two go play first." After the two girls disappeared, Eric first said to Avi Allard, "You should have talked to Joss Whedon, right? What do you think?" "A very creative young man." Avi Allard nodded and said, "Although his directing experience is a little shallow, I believe that with you personally checking, there will be no mistakes." Eric smiled and then turned to Paula Wagner. "So, Paula, how have you been? I heard that Cruise is shooting a new film in New York." Avi Allard had arrived in Los Angeles yesterday afternoon and had already discussed Paula Wagner's intentions with him over the phone. Although Firefly had not officially announced the Marvel Cinematic Universe project to the outside world, this matter was no longer a secret in Hollywood due to Firefly's frequent movements. Some media outlets had even carried out small-scale reports. Perhaps stimulated by Warner's 3 consecutive box office hits of Batman in the past few years, Tom Cruise had also become interested in Iron Man. In his memory of his previous life, Iron Man had actually been in Tom Cruise's bag for a time. It was only because Marvel repeatedly delayed and hesitated, coupled with the fact that the script was not to Cruise's satisfaction, that the two sides parted ways. Speaking of which, as an actor, sometimes opportunities were really important. Take Tom Cruise and Kevin Costner for example. In history, after the box office failure of Future Waterworld, Kevin Costner gradually left the ranks of the A-list superstars. And because of the protection of the Mission Impossible series, although Tom Cruise had also experienced some failures, he was always able to make a comeback with the sequels of Mission Impossible. But now, the Mission Impossible series belonged to Kevin Costner, which also allowed him to save his career in time after the box office failure of Future Waterworld. On the other hand, Tom Cruise was not so lucky. Although he had always been in the A-list, and had tried several big-budget movies in recent years, they could only be said to be mediocre. Gradually, Paramount, who worked closely with Tom Cruise, was not even willing to let Tom Cruise participate in big-budget movies anymore. Instead, they positioned him as a male star in low- to mid-budget literary films. After all, although Tom Cruise had not been recognized by the Oscars, the literary films he starred in were still very guaranteed at the box office. The new film that Eric had just mentioned that Tom Cruise was shooting in New York was also a drama film with a budget of about $40 million. But obviously, Tom Cruise was not willing to continue like this. After all, many of Hollywood's big-budget commercial films, even not to mention the miracle Titanic that had just created a miracle, frequently touched the threshold of $700 million or even $1 billion at the global box office. As for literary films, even if they sold well, the global box office usually only maintained about $300 million. The interests involved were naturally incomparable. Paula Wagner took a sip of coffee and nodded. Yes, this time it's a biographical film. Tom hopes to hit the Oscars again. Eric smiled softly and did not express any opinions on this. He said, "So, this time, why are you interested in Iron Man?" "Eric, don't you think Tom is very suitable for this role?" Paula Wagner said, put down the coffee cup, took out a few photos from her handbag, and handed them over. Eric took a look at them. It turned out to be a rendering of Tom Cruise in the Iron Man armor, which was obviously made with the help of Marvel. After all, the design drafts of the Iron Man armor were currently only available to the senior management of Marvel. Speaking of which, if height was not mentioned, Tom Cruise was very similar to Tony Stark in the comics. After looking at the photos, Eric looked up and said, "Paula, since you have these design drafts, you must have heard of my idea for the role of Iron Man." "Of course," Paula Wagner nodded. "Eric, although it's a little subversive, you must know that Tom is strong enough to play this role. You have worked together in Dark War, haven't you?" Eric nodded with a smile. Except for Tom Cruise's somewhat objectionable desire to control, Eric did not have much prejudice against him. Now, although Tom Cruise was still a Hollywood A-list star, compared with Eric, the two were not in the same weight class. Naturally, he would not care about the small details of the past. In fact, before meeting with Paula Wagner, Eric did not intend to let Tom Cruise play Tony Stark. After all, what he needed was a jerk, not a perfect hero. But Tom Cruise's screen image was exactly the perfect American theme character. His image was deeply ingrained in the hearts of the audience. If he suddenly changed, Eric was not even sure if the audience would buy it. Of course, Tom Cruise's salary was also a big problem. Although Eric had said that he wouldn't refuse to work with an A-list superstar, Tom Cruise was obviously the kind of A-list superstar that was the most difficult to deal with. In the previous life, the Mission Impossible series had been entangled with Paramount for 20 years. Chapter 861. Eric didn't know what Tom Cruise's attitude was, but it was clear that Paula Wagner wanted to facilitate this cooperation. To this end, Paula Wagner also said that Tom Cruise could sign 3 Iron Man contracts with Firefly at once, on the condition that he retained the right to negotiate the remuneration of the sequels. Compared to Tom Cruise's status, this condition was very sincere. Due to the explosion of the film market in recent years, the value of Hollywood stars had risen significantly. Now, it was rare for A-list Hollywood superstars to sign multiple contracts with film companies at once. However, this obviously did not meet Eric's requirements. "Paula, the Marvel Cinematic Universe plan is a very important layout for Firefly. In order to ensure the implementation of this plan, the bottom line for us to choose a core superhero character is to sign at least 6 contracts. This condition is no exception for anyone, so 3 definitely won't do." Paula Wagner said, "Eric, since you attach so much importance to the Marvel Cinematic Universe project, Firefly should obviously be more cautious in selecting actors. I think you must know that no A-list Hollywood superstar will agree to 6 contracts at once." Eric shook his head gently and said, "I think you may have misunderstood something, Paula. Firefly hopes to sign long-term contracts, but that does not mean that we are not willing to pay actors more. We have already drawn up a detailed plan for fluctuating the remuneration. Take Cruise for example. If he is willing to sign, we can even adopt a fluctuating remuneration mechanism from the first film." Paula Wagner glanced calmly at Avi Allard, who was sitting next to her. After she contacted Marvel, Avi Allard seemed very enthusiastic about Cruise's participation in Iron Man. They had only briefly discussed it and rushed to Los Angeles. Therefore, she had not heard from Avi Allard about the fluctuating remuneration plan. From this small detail, Paula Wagner guessed that Avi Allard might not be very supportive of Eric's plan. However, it was not hard to imagine that Eric's 6-contract bundling plan would definitely deter more than 90% of A-list superstars in Hollywood. But in the traditional view of Hollywood, how could a big-budget movie succeed without a big star in it? Even so, Paula Wagner didn't show any abnormalities and continued to ask, "Eric, can you be more specific?" "Of course." Eric nodded and explained patiently, "Take Cruise as an example. Firefly can give him a guaranteed salary of $10 million US. Following that, the film's global box office earnings would be within $300 million US, and the base salary of $10 million US would remain unchanged. Between $300 million US and $500 million US, the increase in remuneration was not too big. For every $100 million US increase, an additional $1 million US would be added because this was still within the range of the film's cost. If the global box office reaches and exceeds $500 million US, multiply the highest box office number by 3 million. That is to say, if the global box office is 500 million, Cruise can get 15 million US. If the global box office is 800 million, Cruise can get 24 million US, and so on. Paula Wagner knew that Eric was just giving a simple example. These numbers were definitely not the final plan. The specific salary contract involved detailed rules and regulations that would definitely reach dozens of pages. However, Paula Wagner also realized that the pay package wasn't very generous. In recent years, the number of Hollywood movies that exceeded $100 million US annually was close to 20, which was almost double the number in the early 1990s. However, although Hollywood films were thriving in the global market, there were still only a handful of films that exceeded US $500 million at the global box office every year. Take last year for example, other than Titanic, the only movies that exceeded $500 million US were The Matrix, The Mummy 2, and Mission Impossible 2. Although Sony's Men in Black 2 and MGM's Charlie's Angels 2 also brought in huge profits for the film company, the global box office was only $400 million US. Because the production cost of mainstream Hollywood movies was still within $100 million US, there were very few movies that exceeded $70 million US. If a movie's global box office reached $300 million US, including the post-production revenue, it was already a big profit for the film company. A global box office of more than $300 million US was the symbol of success for Hollywood movies. Therefore, in Paula Wagner's view, Eric's pay package, although generous on the surface, was more like a pie in the sky. Based on this salary, if an actor wanted to earn $20 million, the global box office would need to reach $700 million. Based on this calculation, last year, the only films that could meet this condition were Titanic and The Matrix. The global box office of The Mummy 2 and Mission Impossible 2 was only slightly more than $600 million. Paula Wagner also did not think that Firefly's plan to mass-produce the Marvel Cinematic Universe had the potential to easily reach $700 million US worldwide box office. Although Cruise's career had entered a slump in recent years, because he acted as a co-investor and producer on most of the movies, even if the movies he participated in were not very good at the box office, it was very easy for him to get $20 million US from each movie. After thinking for a moment, Paula Wagner said, "Eric, if I remember correctly, last year, there were no more than 5 Hollywood movies that reached $500 million US worldwide box office, right? In this case, do you think it's reasonable for the protagonist to only get $15 million US for the global box office of $500 million US?" Eric smiled and looked at Paula Wagner and said, "Paula, you should know that if the Marvel Cinematic Universe project is successful, Cruise will get more than just a salary. At least for the next 10 years, he will be able to rely on the popularity of this movie to stabilize his position as an A-list superstar. I think this is the main reason why you are here today, isn't it?" After missing the Mission Impossible series, Cruise's popularity had been in a state of decline in recent years. If he suffered 1 or 2 more box office failures, he would lose his position as an A-list superstar. John Travolta, Richard Gere, and the like, who had had their moments of glory, had essentially disappeared from the ranks of the A-list. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, and the like were also on the verge of the same situation. In order to maintain his popularity, Arnold Schwarzenegger took on the role of Mr. Freeze in Batman and Robin last year, trying to find a new way to play the villain. Even Mel Gibson, who had achieved good results in his directing career, began to look for a reboot of the Lethal Weapon series. Therefore, Tom Cruise's deeper purpose of seeking to act in Iron Man was actually to maintain his position as an A-list superstar for a long time. Paula Wagner was not embarrassed by Eric's words. She still had a decent smile on her face and said, "Eric, I think this is a win-win situation. As long as you can relax the restrictions of the contract, everyone will benefit a lot. What's more, if the Iron Man series is successful, even if the 3 contracts expire, Tommy will be very happy to renew the contract." Eric thought to himself that with Cruise's bidding style, Firefly would be very unhappy when the time came. Shaking his head gently, Eric said, "Paula, I think it will be difficult for us to reach an agreement. However, other than Iron Man, if Cruise wants to cooperate with Firefly, we will still welcome him." Paula Wagner was a little disappointed. If Cruise cooperated with Paramount, Sony, and other companies, he could still get the most production and marketing resources. However, Firefly, which had many high-quality projects, would certainly not give them such preferential treatment. Therefore, Eric's solicitation was not very attractive to her. Paula Wagner remembered the recent dispute between Firefly and Paramount. She thought that Eric might have said this to attack Paramount. After all, the Cruise/Wagner production company was basically affiliated with Paramount. Knowing that Cruise would not agree to Eric's salary proposal, Eric did not have the slightest intention to compromise, so the two sides did not continue the discussion. After lunch, Paula Wagner left in a hurry. She had to fly back to New York in the afternoon to take charge of Cruise's new film. Avi Allard was not in a hurry to return. He would stay in Los Angeles for a few days. However, after Paula Wagner left, Avi Allard was very disappointed. He did not know much about Hollywood, so he was used to the strategy of big productions, big directors, and big stars, just like the peripheral investors in Hollywood. In Eric's memory, Marvel's initial superhero dream team was Tom Cruise as Iron Man, Brad Pitt as Thor, and Edward Norton as Hulk. Everyone knew the final result. The rise of Marvel superheroes proved the correctness of the strategy of using directors with potential and second- and third-tier newcomers. If Marvel's initial dream team was achieved, then the result would be unpredictable. Just like Warner's Batman series in recent years, because the strong main creator had to negotiate with the producers about the salary, script, and other factors. 4 Batman movies, 3 protagonists, 2 directors, and this strong instability of the main creative team eventually led to the Batman series not being as good as the previous one. Eric did not explain too much to Avi Allard. The two talked about some trivial matters regarding the establishment of Marvel Pictures, and Eric sent Avi Allard out of the manor. Christina was a little depressed today. She had received a call from Eric yesterday to come to the manor for the weekend. She had been very happy. However, early in the morning, the girl named Miranda Kerr had come uninvited and forced her way into their 2-person world. Near noon, 2 more guests arrived. Eric had to leave Los Angeles the next day. It could be said that this weekend was a little bad. It was not until 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the 2 guests had left that Eric was free. But at this time, seeing Miranda pouncing on Eric like a clingy kitten, Christina was even more depressed. She had always been careful in front of Eric and had never dared to be as presumptuous as the girl in front of her. Christina even suspected that the kitten sitting on Eric's lap did not know that she was facing a lion entrenched in Hollywood, or was she too confident that this lion would definitely not eat her in one bite? Miranda Kerr could not be bothered with Christina's entanglement, depression, and other small emotions. She pounced on Eric intimately and hugged his neck coquettishly. "Eric, I saw in the newspaper that the premiere of Casino Royale will be held in London. You'll definitely be there, right?" Eric held Miranda's small waist with both hands and did not let her get too close. He smiled and said, "Yes, but I definitely can't bring you, so don't even think about it." "You're so annoying. I haven't even mentioned it yet." Miranda grabbed Eric's shirt collar and pulled gently. She said in dissatisfaction, "You said last year that you would celebrate my birthday with me. I didn't even see your shadow last month. Hey, how are you going to compensate me?" Eric knew that Giselle would definitely not tell Miranda about their trip around the world. He just smiled and said, "Oh, what kind of compensation do you want?" Miranda straightened her body and gently twisted her waist. She said, "The Disney Channel TV series I'm in now is so boring. Eric, do you think I can play Gwen? Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man? Heh, that won't do. How about this? I'll let you play one of Gwen's female classmates." "That's too insincere. I don't want these small roles." Miranda shook her head in dissatisfaction. She rolled her eyes and said, "Then, Christina and I saw a lot of cars in your garage just now. Oh, so many good cars. What a waste. You haven't even driven them that many times, right?" Eric smiled and pushed the girl away. He held her small waist and stopped her from moving. He said, "If you want, you have to wait until you're 16 years old. You can't do it now." Miranda looked at Christina beside her and rolled her eyes. She said, "Don't I look like I'm 16 years old now? Eric, you can definitely help me get a driver's license, right?" "Yes, so I can't help you." Eric smiled and pinched the girl's face. He said, "Don't be so restless. You're far from the age where you can drive. If something happens, I won't be able to explain it to your parents." Miranda begged for a while more. Seeing that Eric still refused to budge, she changed her condition and said, "Forget it then. You drive me." How about I go for a ride with Christina? Let's do it now." You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.